I came home early from a business trip and found my wife fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. My son and his wife were sitting in the waiting room as calm as if absolutely nothing had happened. I immediately locked every single financial account they had access to. They began panicking instantly. My given name is Douglas Pierce. I am 69 years old, a retired chief mechanical engineer, and a man who believed his family was his greatest legacy. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who mistook your silence for weakness. I returned to our home in the Chicago suburbs 2 days early from an engineering consultancy trip. The house was supposed to be quiet. Instead, the moment I unlocked the heavy oak front door, a chilling sight greeted me in the hallway. Valerie's personal belongings were stacked haphazardly inside 6 large cardboard boxes. Her favorite winter coats, her knitting supplies, and the framed photographs from our mantel were taped shut like discarded trash. I slowly dropped my travel bag on the hardwood floor. A profound sense of dread anchored my boots to the ground. My phone rang sharply in my jacket pocket, shattering the silence of the empty house. I answered it immediately. A brisk professional voice on the other end identified herself as a nurse from Memorial Hospital. She informed me that my wife Valerie was in the intensive care unit currently fighting for her life. The nurse urged me to arrive as quickly as possible. I did not ask questions. I turned around, walked straight back to my car, and drove directly toward the hospital with a cold knot tightening in my chest. I rushed through the sliding glass doors of the hospital lobby, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic rhythm. I quickly navigated the sterile, brightly lit corridors until I reached the intensive care unit waiting area. I expected to find my son pacing the floor in absolute agony. I expected to see tears, panic, and the desperate grief of a child terrified of losing his mother. Instead, I found Cameron and his wife Megan sitting comfortably on a plush leather sofa in the corner of the room. They were completely relaxed. Cameron held a steaming cup of gourmet coffee, taking slow, deliberate sips. Megan rested her manicured hands on an iPad balanced on her lap. They were casually scrolling through a catalog of high-end living room furniture. Neither of them shed a single tear. Neither of them looked even the least bit distressed. I stood frozen at the edge of the waiting room, observing them from a distance. Megan swiped the screen with annoyance and sighed loudly. She loudly whined about the non-refundable deposit they would lose because of this massive inconvenience. She complained bitterly to my son that Valerie's sudden hospitalization had completely ruined their weekend getaway to a luxury resort. Cameron nodded in total agreement, patting her knee to comfort her over a missed vacation while his mother lay dying a few feet away. My blood turned to ice. I am an African-American man who spent 40 years calculating structural integrity and measuring stress points in steel beams. I know exactly what a failing foundation looks like. Watching my 34-year-old son prioritize a velvet couch over his mother showed me a collapse I never wanted to see. I slowly approached them with measured, heavy steps. Cameron looked up, startled by my early arrival. He very quickly locked the iPad screen and stood up, pasting a look of fabricated sorrow across his face. He offered a weak excuse about the doctors keeping them in the dark. Megan offered a hollow greeting, her eyes darting away from mine. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not offer a comforting embrace. She simply crossed her arms and stared at the intensive care doors with visible impatience. I did not scream. I did not throw the cup of coffee out of my son's hands. The absolute sheer disrespect they displayed demanded a far more calculated response. I nodded silently, acknowledging their presence, and walked past them directly toward the nurse's station. I firmly demanded to see my wife immediately. The anger brewing inside me did not erupt into a fiery rage. It condensed into a sharp, frozen resolve. I needed solid medical facts before I unleashed devastating and permanent consequences upon my own flesh and blood. I refused to let my emotions dictate my next move. Before I could push past the swinging doors of the ward, a tall man in a white coat intercepted me. It was the head doctor of the intensive care unit. He placed a firm hand on my shoulder and guided me away from the waiting area, pulling me into a private, soundproof alcove near the supply room. He closed the door behind us, ensuring Cameron and Megan could not hear a single word of our conversation. The doctor looked me directly in the eyes, his expression grave and deeply troubled. He lowered his voice to a bare whisper. He stated clearly that Valerie did not suffer a natural stroke, nor was she the victim of a sudden heart attack. He handed me a preliminary toxicology report printed on a crisp sheet of medical paper. Her blood work showed a massive catastrophic overdose of heavy sedatives. These were prescription-grade tranquilizers that my wife had never been prescribed in her entire life. Furthermore, the physical examination revealed severe dehydration that had occurred over multiple days. The doctor explained that Valerie's kidneys were failing because she had been entirely deprived of water for at least 48 hours. The realization struck me with the force of a freight train. My sweet, kind wife, a woman who spent her entire life caring for our family, had been locked away and deliberately starved of basic human necessities. The doctor explicitly told me this was not an accident. Someone deliberately poisoned my wife, methodically administering sedatives to keep her quiet while her body slowly shut down from dehydration. The boxes in the hallway suddenly made horrifying sense. Cameron and Megan were not cleaning the house. They were actively packing up Valerie's life, entirely confident that she would never return to claim her belongings. They were preparing for a funeral while she was still breathing in her own bedroom. I stared at the medical report in my hands, feeling the last remaining shreds of my fatherly affection burn away into nothingness. The people sitting in the waiting room drinking gourmet coffee were not my family. They were ruthless predators who had targeted my wife for their own personal gain. I thanked the doctor for his honesty. I stepped out of the alcove, my mind operating with the cold precision of a machine preparing for absolute war. I was ready. The sterile smell of the intensive care unit suddenly felt incredibly suffocating. I stood perfectly still outside the doctor's quiet alcove and allowed the horrifying reality to fully wash over me. My beloved wife of 40 years was not suffering from a sudden tragic medical emergency. Valerie was actually the victim of a highly calculated, methodical poisoning. Every instinct built into my 69 years of life screamed at me to march back into that waiting room and wrap my hands around my son's throat. I wanted to drag Cameron and his wife out of their comfortable leather chairs immediately and demand a full confession. But 40 years as a chief mechanical engineer had taught me that explosive anger never solved a structural failure. Emotional outbursts only compromise the integrity of your foundation. I needed absolute proof to fortify my position before I dropped the hammer on them. I turned away from the waiting area and walked silently down the pristine white corridor until I reached an empty, echo-filled emergency stairwell. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind me, sealing me in complete isolation. I leaned against the cold concrete wall and slowly pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. My hands remained completely steady. I bypassed our standard joint checking accounts and navigated directly into the highly secure portal of Valerie's emergency medical fund. We had meticulously built that specific safety net over 3 decades, sacrificing luxury vacations and expensive cars to ensure a massive, untouchable reserve for a critical day exactly like today. I entered my master authentication password and braced myself for whatever financial discrepancies I might uncover. The bright screen loaded the transaction history. I stared at the rapidly descending balance, and the true, sinister scale of my son's betrayal finally materialized right before my eyes. The digital ledger painted a devastating picture of greed and malice. The cold, bright screen displayed a rapid, highly systematic series of maximum-limit wire transfers executed over the exact 5 days I had been away on my engineering consultancy trip. Day after day, entirely staggering sums of cash were ripped directly from Valerie's life-saving reserve. The money was not routed to pay for a specialized medical facility or an advanced treatment program. Every single transfer pointed directly into a newly opened, completely private checking account registered exclusively under Megan's name. My greedy daughter-in-law was actively draining the very funds required to keep my wife alive, effectively stealing Valerie's blood money to line her own pockets. Cameron was undoubtedly orchestrating the complex technical bypasses while Megan secured the stolen cash. They timed this perfectly, assuming my lengthy business absence and Valerie's rapidly deteriorating condition would leave the vault entirely unguarded. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer audacity of their crime solidify my fierce resolve. I did not waste time mourning the son I thought I had raised. I immediately tapped the specific contact icon for my private wealth manager at the primary banking institution. The secure line rang twice before he answered with a polite, familiar greeting. I bypassed all standard pleasantries and instructed him to enact a severe emergency security protocol across my entire financial portfolio. I firmly identified myself as the primary account holder and the sole legal architect of the family trust. I ordered the manager to instantly freeze every single credit card, debit card, and joint checking account tied to Cameron and Megan. I specifically demanded a hard, permanent lockdown on the corporate accounts they had been granted proxy access to 5 years ago when I attempted to integrate my son into the family business. The bank manager hesitated for a brief moment, asking if I was absolutely certain about initiating such a drastic financial embargo without any prior warning to the secondary users. I told him my instructions were final, absolute, and entirely non-negotiable under any circumstances. Any attempt by Cameron or Megan to withdraw cash, process a new credit transaction, or move digital assets would result in a hard decline and an immediate security flag. I stayed silently on the secure line while the manager typed rapidly on his keyboard, listening closely to the sharp clicking sounds as he built an impenetrable digital fortress around my money. He verbally confirmed that the massive financial lockdown was fully active across all global platforms. The previously unlimited proxy access was completely and permanently severed. The massive golden parachute my son and his wife had come to heavily rely on was abruptly cut without warning. I thanked the manager, hung up the phone, and slipped the heavy device back into my suit pocket. My vast wealth was now entirely secure. The trap was perfectly set. It was time to watch the predators panic when they realized their stolen resources were completely erased. I stepped out of the stairwell and walked back toward the main hospital concourse, projecting unshakable calm. Exactly 10 minutes later, a loud argument erupted near the entrance of the upscale hospital cafeteria. The sharp, entitled voice cutting through the quiet medical environment unmistakably belonged to my daughter-in-law, Megan. I stood near a decorative pillar and carefully watched the humiliating scene unfold. Megan stood at the cashier's counter with a tray piled high with expensive artisanal salads, premium imported waters, and gourmet desserts. She thrust her platinum credit card at the bewildered cashier, demanding that the machine be run again immediately. The young cashier politely explained that the card was reading as entirely invalid and suggested she try an alternative payment method. Megan's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. She threw a dramatic tantrum, screaming that her account balance was practically infinite and accusing the cashier of operating a completely broken machine. Cameron quickly jogged over from a nearby seating area to intervene, pulling his own premium debit card from his tailored suit jacket. He swiped his card with an arrogant smirk, expecting to resolve the embarrassing situation and soothe his frustrated wife. The machine beeped a harsh, unforgiving tone, declined. Cameron frowned, his confident facade instantly cracking under the sudden weight of public humiliation. He frantically pulled his smartphone from his pocket and launched his mobile banking application. I watched from the shadows as the color completely drained from my son's face. He tapped the screen repeatedly, his thumbs moving in a frantic, desperate rhythm as the app continually locked him out with bold, red error messages. The unlimited financial tap he had ruthlessly exploited had been permanently welded shut. Cameron shoved his phone back into his pocket, completely abandoning his wife at the register. He whipped his head around his eyes, scanning the vast hospital corridor until they finally locked directly onto my position. His false sorrow instantly vanished entirely, replaced by an incredibly ugly, unfiltered, and deeply violent rage. He realized exactly who held all the power. Cameron charged down the brightly lit hallway toward me, his expensive leather shoes stomping heavily against the polished linoleum floor. His hands were balled into tight fists, and his jaw was clenched so incredibly hard I could clearly see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. The ultimate confrontation he had desperately tried to avoid was now barreling straight toward me. Cameron charged down the brightly lit hallway toward me, his expensive leather shoes stomping heavily against the polished linoleum floor. His hands were balled into tight fists, and his jaw was clenched so incredibly hard I could clearly see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. The ultimate confrontation he had desperately tried to avoid was now barreling straight toward me. He stopped abruptly, mere inches from my face, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. He demanded to know exactly what kind of malfunction was happening with his corporate accounts, raising his voice loudly enough to draw the attention of several passing nurses. He aggressively fabricated a story about an absolute cash flow emergency at his startup company, claiming he desperately needed the funds transferred immediately to secure a vital shipment of inventory. His lies were so practiced, so remarkably smooth, that a lesser man might have believed him. I, however, had spent my entire career analyzing flawed structural designs and the cracks in my son's fabricated panic were glaringly obvious. I maintained a cold, entirely unreadable expression. I did not flinch, I did not raise my voice, and I completely refused his outrageous demand. I simply let the silence hang heavily between us, forcing him to stew in his own escalating anxiety. When the tension reached a boiling point, I calmly asked him a very specific question regarding the large cardboard boxes currently occupying my living room floor. I asked him why his mother's personal belongings were taped shut like discarded garbage while she was actively fighting for her life in an intensive care unit. Cameron opened his mouth to deliver another rehearsed lie, but Megan stepped forward quickly, forcefully pushing past her husband. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a look of utter disdain twisting her features. Megan arrogantly stated that they fully intended to permanently relocate Valerie into a low-income care facility by the end of the week. She brazenly claimed this drastic move would significantly ease their financial and emotional burden. With a chilling sense of entitlement, she added that they desperately needed Valerie's master bedroom cleared out immediately so contractors could begin constructing a massive custom walk-in closet for her growing collection of designer clothes. Megan spoke to me with absolute unfiltered disrespect. She openly dismissed my 40 years of hard work, labeling me a washed-up senile old man who simply needed to step aside and surrender control of the family assets. She sneered, demanding I release the banking restrictions immediately or she would ensure my final years were spent in absolute misery. I stared at the two people standing before me, fully comprehending the true depth of their malevolence. They were not merely greedy, they were entirely unburdened by basic human empathy. I turned my back on them without uttering another word. I walked briskly out of the hospital, ignoring Cameron's furious shouts echoing down the corridor. I needed to act quickly and decisively. I drove directly back to our home, my mind racing through complex contingency plans. My immediate objective was to gather Valerie's specific medical history documents to aid the doctors in neutralizing the poison coursing through her veins. I unlocked the front door and moved purposefully through the silent house, walking straight into our master bedroom. I approached the large digital wall safe concealed behind a heavy oak bookcase. The sight before me instantly shattered my calculated composure. The heavy steel door of the safe was completely destroyed, brutally drilled open and forcefully pried off its reinforced hinges. The interior shelves were entirely emptied. Our irreplaceable family heirlooms, my late mother's jewelry, and a stack of municipal bonds were all missing. More importantly, one highly sensitive, profoundly crucial legal document had been explicitly targeted and removed. The medical power of attorney, the absolute legal authority over my wife's healthcare decisions, had been stolen from the wreckage. I knelt on the hardwood floor and brushed my fingers over the jagged metal edges of the decimated wall safe. The sharp steel bit into my skin, a physical reminder that the boundary between familial entitlement and outright criminal action had been irrevocably crossed. Cameron and Megan were not simply waiting for my wife to pass away so they could inherit our wealth. They were actively orchestrating her demise and simultaneously dismantling the legal protections I had meticulously built over 4 decades. I stood up and surveyed the master bedroom. They assumed I was merely an obsolete engineer, a relic of a bygone industrial era who lacked the modern sophistication to secure his own home. They were profoundly mistaken. I walked over to the far corner of the room, approaching an old, heavily modified air purifier resting on a mahogany side table. I constructed the internal mechanisms of this device over 5 years ago officially to help Valerie with her seasonal allergies. However, embedded deep within the custom filtration housing was a hidden motion-sensing security camera linked directly to an internal encrypted memory card. I designed it to operate independently from the primary home network, ensuring it could never be disabled remotely. My son always mocked my tendency to overcomplicate simple household items, entirely unaware that this specific habit was about to become his ultimate undoing. I unlatched the discreet back panel of the purifier and extracted the small black memory card with steady fingers. I walked to my heavy oak desk, flipped open my laptop, and inserted the card into the reader. The digital folder populated immediately, displaying dozens of video files recorded over the exact 5 days I had been away on my consultancy trip. I took a deep breath and braced myself for the brutal truth. I clicked on the first video file, my jaw clenching as the crisp image filled the computer screen. The recording from 3 days ago showed Valerie sitting on the edge of the bed, looking visibly disoriented and pale. Megan marched into the frame, her expression devoid of any human compassion. She carried a small glass of water and a plastic cup filled with an assortment of large, unidentified pills. Valerie weakly shook her head clearly, trying to refuse the medication, raising a frail hand to push the cup away. Megan did not display a single ounce of hesitation. She aggressively grabbed my wife by the jaw, tilting her head back with absolute brute force, and forcefully shoved the handful of heavy sedatives directly down her throat. Valerie gagged and choked, struggling against the physical assault, but Megan ruthlessly held her mouth shut until she was forced to swallow. I watched in frozen horror as my daughter-in-law turned her back on a gasping woman, walked confidently out of the bedroom, and audibly locked the heavy wooden door from the outside. The subsequent video files captured the agonizing aftermath of that malicious act. Valerie collapsed onto the mattress, her body completely surrendering to the massive dose of illicit tranquilizers. For 2 entire days, the camera recorded her lying there in the suffocating silence, completely denied access to a single drop of water, while her internal organs slowly began to shut down from severe dehydration. Megan never returned to check on her. The sheer calculated cruelty of the crime was perfectly documented in high definition. My anger intensified into a blinding white-hot focus as I opened the final recording dated just yesterday afternoon. The camera captured Cameron entering the master bedroom with a large canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He did not even glance at his mother, who was currently lying entirely motionless on the bed just a few feet away. He walked directly to the mahogany bookcase, shoved it aside with aggressive force, and exposed the digital wall safe. He pulled a commercial-grade power drill from his bag, equipped with a diamond-tipped masonry bit. I watched my own flesh and blood spend 45 minutes methodically destroying the heavy steel locking mechanism I trusted to protect our vital assets. When the thick metal door finally swung open, Cameron eagerly dug his hands inside. He bypassed the stacks of emergency cash and the velvet boxes containing my vintage jewelry. He was searching for something highly specific. He pulled out a thick manila envelope, ripped it open, and extracted our certified medical power of attorney document. He held the legal paperwork up to the light, a triumphant, wicked smile spreading across his face as he realized he now possessed the absolute legal authority to dictate whether his mother lived or died. He shoved the document into his pocket, kicked the broken safe door shut, and walked out of the room, leaving Valerie to die in the shadows. I pulled my phone from my pocket with rigid fingers and immediately dialed the direct emergency line for Attorney Bradley, my trusted legal counsel and close personal friend for over 20 years. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and attentive. I bypassed all standard greetings and swiftly detailed the horrific reality of the situation, explaining the undeniable video evidence of attempted murder and the deliberate theft of the crucial legal document from my destroyed safe. Bradley cursed loudly under his breath, recognizing the profound gravity of the escalating crisis. He asked me to hold the line while he urgently logged into the county court registry to verify if Cameron had executed his treacherous plan. The silence on the phone felt agonizingly long as the seconds ticked by. My eyes remained fixed on the broken safe, my mind mapping out the exact trajectory of my son's malicious strategy. Bradley finally returned to the line, and the tone of his voice was remarkably grim. He delivered the devastating news without sugarcoating a single word. Cameron had walked into the local courthouse exactly 1 hour ago and formally submitted the stolen medical power of attorney to a sitting judge. My son had initiated a rapid emergency petition to completely strip me of my spousal rights, falsely claiming I was entirely unfit to make medical decisions for my wife. The fraudulent legal filings explicitly dictated his intention to immediately transfer Valerie into a terminal hospice care facility, effectively signing her death warrant under the guise of compassionate medical intervention. Furthermore, Bradley revealed a secondary petition attached to the filing. Cameron was moving to legally seize full control of my residential property, claiming he needed to forcefully sell the house to cover the astronomical costs of his mother's impending end-of-life care. The sheer audacity of his scheme was breathtaking. He intended to legally murder his mother, banish his father, and liquidate my entire estate to fund his lavish lifestyle, all while hiding perfectly behind the protective shield of the legal system. My greedy son genuinely believed he had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner, completely stripping me of every possible defense. He truly thought he had already won the war. I thanked Bradley, disconnected the call, and stared at the dark screen of my laptop. It was finally time to unleash the ultimate devastating adjustment against my own son. I drove through the desolate city streets long before the sun even considered rising over the horizon. The dark roads perfectly matched the cold calculation humming inside my mind. I parked my car in the empty underground lot of a towering glass building and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. Attorney Bradley was already waiting for me in his corner office, a steaming mug of black coffee resting on his expansive mahogany desk. Bradley and I had navigated complex legal landscapes together for over 2 decades, but the atmosphere this morning carried an unprecedented weight. I walked straight to his desk and slammed my heavy leather briefcase down on the polished wood. I extracted the digital copies of the court filings Cameron had submitted just hours prior and spread them out under the harsh fluorescent desk lamp. We stood side by side, analyzing the legal snare my own son had constructed to trap me and effectively murder his mother. The paperwork was incredibly thorough, detailing Valerie's fabricated mental decline and my supposed inability to manage her medical care. Cameron had hired premium lawyers to draft a petition that painted him as a compassionate savior stepping in to rescue a dying woman from a negligent husband. The sheer volume of perjured statements and fabricated medical assessments demonstrated a terrifying level of premeditation. He had likely been building this specific legal framework for months while smiling at our dinner table. Bradley sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as he scanned the final page of the malicious court order. The enemy had successfully executed a preemptive strike using the legal system as a weapon to strip me of my absolute legal right to protect my beloved wife. We needed to formulate a completely ruthless counterattack immediately to destroy his vicious plan. Bradley tapped a silver pen against the stolen medical power of attorney document illuminated on his computer monitor. He warned me in a grim tone that the signature resting at the bottom of the page looked utterly flawless. He explained that Cameron had clearly hired a professional forensic forger to replicate Valerie's exact handwriting stroke by stroke. Cameron prepared this trap meticulously, ensuring the paperwork would seamlessly pass a standard judicial review without raising any immediate red flags. Bradley cautioned that battling a court-approved mandate could easily take months of grueling litigation time that my comatose wife simply did not possess. I listened to my lawyer outline the dire reality of the situation, but I entirely refused to panic. I maintained a perfectly steady posture and leaned forward across the mahogany desk. I revealed a deeply buried piece of our financial past, a defensive strategy I had implemented long before Cameron ever developed his overwhelming greed. I explained to Bradley that the sprawling suburban house, the lucrative investment portfolios, and the primary liquid assets were not actually registered under my personal name or Valerie's name. I had anticipated the unpredictable nature of massive wealth accumulation during my career as a chief mechanical engineer. I systematically placed everything we owned inside an irrevocable corporate trust exactly 10 years ago. The entity known strictly as Pierce Industrial Trust legally held absolute ownership of our entire estate. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile as the realization washed over my attorney. The forged medical power of attorney granted Cameron authority over Valerie's personal health decisions, but it granted him absolutely zero legal authority over any corporate real estate or trust-protected capital. Cameron fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of my financial empire. He assumed that incapacitating my wife and neutralizing me would grant him immediate unrestricted access to the keys to the kingdom. He completely failed to realize that the kingdom was an impenetrable fortress guarded by corporate bylaws that he could never casually drill open or forge his way through. Bradley's eyes widened with profound professional respect as he rapidly cross-referenced the county property records database. He typed fiercely, pulling up the official property deed for our residential address. The glowing screen proudly confirmed my statement, listing Pierce Industrial Trust as the sole undisputed property owner. Bradley let out a sharp, triumphant bark of laughter, realizing the magnificent trap my son had unwittingly walked right into. Cameron had essentially stolen a useless piece of paper to control an estate that did not exist in the manner he believed. He had committed multiple massive federal felonies, including forgery, elder abuse, and grand larceny, merely to acquire an empty prize. I instructed Bradley to immediately draft the necessary corporate injunctions required to formally evict any unauthorized individuals attempting to claim domain over trust property. I was no longer playing the role of a devastated father reacting to a family tragedy. I was absolutely prepared to fight and win this vital legal battle, today. As Bradley began fiercely typing the necessary corporate legal documents, a sharp, prolonged vibration erupted from the interior pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out my smartphone and instantly recognized the distinct chime of my primary home security application. A high-priority push notification flashed brightly across the locked screen, explicitly warning me of multiple unidentified physical intrusions detected at my private residential address. I swiped the alert to immediately open the live high-definition security camera feed, actively monitoring the front entrance of my suburban estate. I stared at the bright display, my jaw clenching as the brazen, horrifying scene unfolded in real time, right before my eyes. Cameron had not wasted a single solitary second after executing his fraudulent court maneuver. He was currently standing squarely in the center of my meticulously maintained living room, acting as if he already owned the entire property. He was confidently guiding 3 professionally dressed real estate agents through the spacious ground floor of my home. My son was gesturing wildly enthusiastically, pointing out the custom architectural upgrades Valerie and I had designed decades ago, treating our cherished family memories as cheap selling points. He arrogantly instructed the lead agent to immediately begin capturing high-quality staging photographs for an aggressive, expedited market listing. I watched him casually kick one of Valerie's packed cardboard boxes out of the visual frame so the photographer could capture a perfectly unobstructed shot of the expensive hardwood floors. The utter lack of basic human decency was staggering. He was actively attempting to liquidate my home, sell off my sanctuary, and completely erase my existence while my wife was struggling to survive in a hospital bed miles away. I did not utter a single word of complaint to Bradley. I simply turned the smartphone screen around, displaying the live, undeniable video evidence of Cameron's active trespassing and illicit real estate machinations. Bradley stopped typing instantly, his eyes narrowing as he watched my son boldly parade the confused agents through my private domain. The attorney gave me a curt, resolute nod, silently confirming that our legal trap was primed and ready for deployment. I grabbed the certified corporate trust documents directly off the desk, shoved them securely into my briefcase, and turned sharply toward the heavy office door. It was finally time to return home, corner the arrogant trespasser, and completely crush his criminal operation right now. The drive back to my suburban estate took exactly 22 minutes. I navigated the familiar winding roads with absolute mechanical precision. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly as my mind continuously processed the sheer audacity of my son's criminal maneuvers. I parked my car quietly at the far end of the long driveway to avoid immediate detection. I stepped out into the crisp morning air and walked purposefully toward the heavy oak front door. My home, the sanctuary Valerie and I had painstakingly built over 3 decades, felt heavily violated. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the door open without making a sound. The spacious foyer was brightly lit, the morning sun streaming through the large bay windows and reflecting off the polished hardwood floors. I walked directly into the main living room and found exactly what the security cameras had warned me about. 3 real estate agents stood near the fireplace holding glossy clipboards and professional cameras. They were busy evaluating the square footage and discussing staging strategies. Standing right in the center of them was Cameron. My son was wearing a smug, victorious smile that completely masked the dark reality of what he had done to his own mother. He held a thick stack of legal documents in his right hand. The moment he heard my footsteps, he spun around to face me. His confident posture did not waver. Instead, he raised his arm and began aggressively waving the stolen forged medical power of attorney directly in my face. He brandished the stolen paperwork like a conquered flag, entirely convinced that those fraudulent pages granted him supreme authority over my entire existence. The immediate, unavoidable confrontation I had meticulously prepared for alongside Attorney Bradley had finally arrived right in my own living room. Cameron did not even attempt to offer a polite greeting. He immediately raised his voice, projecting a tone of exaggerated, artificial authority designed specifically to impress his captive audience. He loudly ordered me to go straight upstairs and pack a single suitcase with my basic necessities. He declared that my time living in this property was officially over. He then turned to the 3 real estate agents, offering them an apologetic theatrical sigh. He smoothly fed them a rehearsed narrative stating that I was suffering from rapidly advancing severe dementia. He claimed my cognitive decline had become a massive danger to myself and the community, forcing him to reluctantly step up and take over as the responsible, deeply burdened son. He pointed at the forged paperwork in his hand, assuring the agents that a judge had already granted him full legal conservatorship over my affairs and my assets. The 3 agents turned their gaze toward me. Their eyes were filled with profound, patronizing pity. They looked at me not as an accomplished mechanical engineer, but as a tragic, helpless old man whose mind had utterly failed him. I felt the immense weight of their silent judgment, but I absolutely refused to break my composure. I did not raise my voice in a desperate attempt to defend my sanity. I did not yell at my son or accuse him of his sickening crimes in front of strangers. I knew that demonstrating any erratic emotional behavior would only serve to validate his fabricated narrative of mental instability. Instead, I maintained a perfectly stoic, unreadable expression. I buttoned my suit jacket with deliberate calmness and took 3 measured steps toward the lead real estate agent. The woman shifted uncomfortably as I approached, clutching her clipboard tightly against her chest. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored jacket and smoothly extracted the thick, legally certified document Attorney Bradley had urgently prepared for me just an hour prior. The heavy paper bore the raised golden seal of the county clerk. I extended my arm and handed the official deed of trust directly to the lead agent, bypassing Cameron entirely. I politely requested that she thoroughly review the primary ownership designation listed clearly on the second page before she proceeded to take any more photographs of my private residence. Cameron scoffed loudly, crossing his arms and rolling his eyes. He arrogantly told the agent to completely ignore me, claiming I was likely handing her an old grocery receipt or a meaningless piece of scrap paper. He insisted his court-mandated power of attorney completely superseded any document a senile man could possibly possess. The lead agent hesitated for a brief moment, her eyes darting nervously between my son's furious face and my calm, unwavering demeanor. Her professional curiosity ultimately won the silent battle. She carefully unfolded the heavy document, adjusted her reading glasses, and scanned the dense, irrefutable legal text. The lead agent's professional smile evaporated instantly as her eyes tracked across the undeniable legal text. The certified deed clearly listed the absolute sole owner of the sprawling suburban estate as Pierce Industrial Trust. My name was explicitly documented as the singular, unremovable executor of that corporate entity. The document completely nullified the fraudulent medical paperwork Cameron was desperately clutching. The agent quickly realized that the man who had hired them possessed absolutely zero legal authority to list, sell, or even occupy the property. She lowered the paperwork, her face flushing with severe professional embarrassment. She looked directly at Cameron and sharply informed him that his medical power of attorney held no jurisdiction whatsoever over corporate real estate assets. She firmly stated that attempting to sell a commercially shielded property without the executor's explicit consent constituted massive real estate fraud. Without waiting for his fabricated response, she immediately canceled the market listing, ordered her team to pack up their expensive camera equipment, and marched briskly out of my house. The heavy front door clicked shut, leaving Cameron and me standing alone in the dead silence of the living room. The harsh reality of his catastrophic failure crashed over him like a physical blow. His grand scheme to swiftly liquidate my home and steal my wealth was completely demolished by a single piece of corporate paper I had filed a decade ago to protect my family from external predators. I never imagined the predator would be my own flesh and blood. Cameron erupted into a blinding, violent rage. He screamed a vicious string of profanities, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred. He violently swept his arm across a decorative side table, sending a heavy crystal vase crashing into the hardwood floor. The thick glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces, scattering across the room. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. He venomously vowed that this minor legal technicality would not save me from his ultimate control. He promised to return with medical professionals and a squad of armed police officers by tomorrow morning. He swore he would forcibly drag me out of my home and permanently lock me inside a maximum security psychiatric ward. His dark threat hung heavily in the air, officially setting the stage for an absolute war. I stepped out the front door and left Cameron standing amidst the shattered glass of his own ruined temper. I did not look back. My focus remained entirely on the woman lying in a hospital bed miles away. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with mechanical precision, guiding my car back toward the towering medical complex. The sterile, highly sanitized smell of the intensive care unit washed over me the moment I stepped off the elevator. I walked quietly into Valerie's room and pulled a rigid plastic chair right up to the edge of her bed. I held her fragile, unmoving hand. Her skin felt terrifyingly cold against my palm. I sat there listening to the steady mechanical rhythm of the life support machines pumping oxygen into her lungs. I refused to let my mind dwell on the sorrow. I needed absolute facts to execute the next phase of my retaliation. I pulled out my laptop, balanced it carefully on my knees, and initiated a secure video conference. I bypassed standard legal channels and directly contacted a highly specialized firm of forensic accountants I had utilized during my corporate engineering days. These individuals were experts at dismantling complex financial labyrinths. I authorized a massive retainer fee directly from the Pierce Industrial Trust holding account. I gave them one explicit directive. I needed them to trace every single dollar that Cameron and Megan had illicitly drained from Valerie's emergency medical fund over the past 5 days. I demanded a comprehensive map showing the exact routing numbers, offshore blind accounts, and final destinations of the stolen cash. The lead accountant accepted the contract without hesitation, promising a preliminary diagnostic report within 2 hours. I closed the laptop screen and gently squeezed my wife's hand. I promised her absolute, unwavering, and severe justice. Exactly 2 hours later, an encrypted email pinged loudly on my laptop screen. The lead forensic accountant had delivered his preliminary findings. I opened the heavily protected PDF document and rapidly scanned the meticulously compiled data. The detailed report confirmed my darkest, most cynical suspicions. Cameron had screamed in my face about a desperate cash flow emergency at his failing tech startup. He had aggressively claimed that he desperately needed the funds to secure a vital shipment of inventory to keep his business afloat. That entire narrative was a complete fabricated lie. The stolen money never touched a single corporate account associated with his fledgling company. Instead, the financial map revealed a far more sinister and profoundly selfish scheme engineered entirely by my daughter-in-law. Megan had ruthlessly hijacked the funds and systematically routed the money through a labyrinth of 3 separate offshore shell corporations. She executed these complex digital maneuvers specifically to erase the financial trail and obscure the true origin of the stolen capital. The final destination of the laundered cash was incredibly illuminating. Megan used the entirety of Valerie's life savings to forcefully purchase a massive controlling ownership stake in a highly lucrative medical technology startup. This particular company was currently in the final stages of preparing for a massive initial public offering. She had utilized her dying mother-in-law's blood money to rapidly construct her own independent, untouchable empire of wealth. She completely bypassed her husband's failing business venture to secure her own financial supremacy. Cameron had dutifully played the role of the aggressive enforcer, breaking into my wall safe and forging legal documents to keep me distracted. He had blindly followed his wife's malicious orders, entirely unaware that she was actively using the stolen resources to build a separate financial kingdom that excluded him completely. She had played my arrogant son for an absolute fool. I read the final pages of the diagnostic report, observing the exact wire transfer confirmation codes that definitively proved Megan's sole ownership of the newly acquired technology shares. The sheer scope of her sociopathic ambition was staggering. She did not just want to ease her perceived burden by moving my wife into a low-income facility. She wanted to actively profit from Valerie's agonizing demise. I slowly downloaded the entire forensic dossier onto a secure external flash drive, ensuring I had multiple encrypted copies of her irrefutable guilt. I intended to weaponize this exact document to systematically destroy her ill-gotten empire. I closed the email window and returned my attention to my wife. The sterile room remained deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic pumping of the mechanical ventilator keeping Valerie tethered to this world. I prepared to contact Attorney Bradley immediately to initiate the next complex phase of our coordinated legal counterattack. I needed to ensure that my son and his wicked wife would face absolute ruin for the unforgivable atrocities they had committed against my innocent family, permanently stripping them of all power, prestige, and stolen financial stability once and for all. Before I could even reach for my smartphone, a piercing, high-pitched alarm shattered the suffocating silence of the intensive care unit. The horrifying sound originated directly from the complex array of digital monitors stationed right beside Valerie's bed. I dropped my laptop onto the plastic chair and immediately leaped to my feet. The rhythmic, steady green lines tracking her fragile heartbeat suddenly spiked into chaotic, jagged red waves before rapidly flatlining into a terrifying, continuous drone. The mechanical ventilator hissed aggressively, desperately attempting to force oxygen into her failing lungs. I yelled out for immediate medical assistance, my voice booming down the sterile hospital corridor. Within seconds, a swarm of doctors and rapid response nurses rushed past me into the crowded room. They forcefully shoved me aside, completely taking over the small space as they initiated emergency resuscitation protocols. The chief physician barked a series of rapid, complex medical orders demanding emergency crash carts and intravenous chemical stabilizers. I stood frozen against the cold hospital wall, utterly helpless as I watched the medical team fight to physically restart my wife's stopped heart. A senior nurse quickly reviewed the massive cascading data pouring across the central diagnostic screen. She shouted out a terrifying update to the chief physician. The specific black market drug Megan had forcefully administered was severely compounding with the existing dehydration. The toxic combination was actively causing sudden catastrophic and cascading organ failure throughout Valerie's entire weakened body. Her kidneys had entirely shut down and her liver was rapidly following suit. The lethal unregulated sedatives were effectively acting like a highly corrosive acid, actively dismantling her internal systems hour by hour. The medical team frantically administered a heavy dose of epinephrine directly into her central intravenous line. The chief physician loudly warned his team that standard life support measures were rapidly losing their effectiveness against this specific synthetic poison. He stated they had merely minutes left to permanently reverse the massive chemical damage before Valerie suffered absolute irreversible brain death. I watched the chaotic, desperate battle unfold before my eyes, the true horror of Megan's calculated homicidal scheme fully materializing in the frantic shouts of the medical staff. The financial theft was entirely secondary now. My wife was actively dying right in front of me, and the perpetrators were eagerly waiting to celebrate her demise. I clenched my fists tightly, vowing to make them pay for every single second. The frantic chaos inside the intensive care unit stretched into a grueling 2-hour battle for my wife's survival. The medical team utilized every available chemical intervention to aggressively flush the lethal synthetic toxins from her bloodstream. I stood perfectly still in the sterile corner of the room, watching the chief physician frantically orchestrate the emergency protocols. The erratic, jagged red lines on the cardiac monitor eventually settled into a weak but steady rhythm. The immediate danger of sudden cardiac arrest passed, but the devastating chemical damage had already taken a severe toll. The physician approached me with a grave expression, his green scrubs soaked with sweat. He quietly explained that they had successfully stabilized Valerie's vitals, but the sheer shock to her neurological system had forced her brain into a deep, unresponsive coma. She was alive, but her internal organs were still critically compromised by the lingering poison. He stated that standard dialysis treatments were proving completely ineffective against this specific black market chemical compound. There was only one viable medical option left to permanently neutralize the synthetic acid ravaging her kidneys. He detailed a highly specialized experimental intravenous antidote currently stored in the hospital's restricted pharmacy vault. The stark reality immediately followed his proposed solution. The life-saving antidote was not approved by standard health insurance protocols, and administering the mandatory dosage required an immediate out-of-pocket authorization of exactly $80,000. Furthermore, because Valerie was entirely incapacitated, the hospital administration mandated explicit legal consent from her designated medical proxy before releasing the restricted pharmaceutical. I reached into my jacket to pull out my primary banking credentials, fully prepared to authorize the massive transaction instantly. Before I could even speak to confirm the payment, a loud commotion erupted in the hallway directly outside the sterile room. Cameron and Megan confidently marched into the intensive care unit, their expensive leather shoes echoing sharply against the polished linoleum floor. They were closely flanked by a sharp-suited private lawyer who carried a thick leather briefcase. The sheer arrogance radiating from their synchronized strides confirmed they believed their victory was absolute. They completely ignored me, standing inside the glass-walled patient room, and walked directly toward the central nurses' station. The lawyer aggressively slapped a thick stack of certified legal documents onto the high counter, commanding the immediate attention of the shift supervisor and the chief physician. I stepped out of the room to confront them, but the lawyer raised his hand, warning me to maintain a legal distance. Cameron glared at me with profound malice before turning his attention entirely to the medical staff. With a booming voice designed to intimidate the entire floor, he formally presented the court-approved medical power of attorney. He loudly declared himself the sole legal custodian of Valerie's healthcare decisions, entirely stripping me of my spousal authority. Megan stood firmly by his side, crossing her arms and projecting a cold, calculated aura of manufactured grief. She smoothly informed the physician that the family had made a highly difficult but compassionate ethical decision regarding Valerie's terminal condition. Cameron nodded in agreement, staring directly into the physician's eyes without a single trace of genuine sorrow. He officially instructed the hospital administration to permanently withhold the specialized non-insured antidote required to neutralize the toxic chemical compounds. He explicitly ordered the medical team to immediately cease all aggressive life-saving interventions, cruelly stating that they preferred to let his mother pass away naturally and peacefully. I stepped forward, furiously demanding that they approve the $80,000 pharmaceutical requisition using my own private funds. Megan offered a chilling, victorious smirk and swiftly interrupted my desperate plea. Her private lawyer handed the chief physician a secondary injunction explicitly barring any external financial interference or contradictory medical directives from unauthorized family members. The lawyer coldly reminded the hospital staff that administering any experimental chemical treatment against the direct legal orders of the certified medical proxy constituted criminal medical malpractice. The chief physician looked at me with profound, agonizing helplessness. He was a man of science bound entirely by the rigid bureaucratic chains of modern healthcare law. He slowly lowered the requisition tablet, his shoulders slumping as he formally acknowledged the flawless legal paperwork presented before him. The hospital administration had absolutely no choice but to fully comply with the court-mandated directive. They were legally paralyzed, forced to step back and watch an innocent woman slowly succumb to a toxic chemical assault simply because her son held the proper judicial stamp. Cameron grinned proudly, tucking the forged document back into his expensive designer jacket. He had successfully weaponized the judicial system to execute his mother in broad daylight. The massive structural trap had completely snapped shut around me. To escape, I must quickly pivot my entire approach immediately. I stared at the pristine white hospital floor, my mind rapidly calculating the horrific reality of my immediate parameters. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that I was currently legally blocked from initiating any direct medical intervention. The forged paperwork had successfully erected an impenetrable bureaucratic wall between my dying wife and the critical antidote she desperately required. If I continued to aggressively fight them in this highly public hospital corridor, the private lawyer would effortlessly summon the local authorities to have me physically removed from the premises for causing a disruptive disturbance. I needed to instantly manufacture a deceptive window of opportunity to bypass their ironclad legal blockade. I deliberately dropped my shoulders, allowing my posture to visibly crumble under the crushing weight of manufactured despair. I implemented a calculated tactical retreat. I forced a look of utter, devastating defeat across my aging features and let out a broken, shuddering breath. I slowly raised my hands in a universal gesture of total surrender. I looked directly at Cameron, forcing genuine tears to well up in the corners of my eyes, letting them spill softly down my cheeks. I begged them in a frail, trembling voice to grant me just 24 hours to sit peacefully by her bedside and properly say goodbye to the only woman I had ever loved before they officially pulled the plug. I intentionally played the exact pathetic role they had scripted for me, the broken, obsolete old man entirely crushed by the unstoppable gears of their superior legal machinery. Megan stared at my weeping face, her eyes gleaming with absolute, unfiltered, sadistic pleasure. She offered a cold, triumphant smirk, thoroughly enjoying the profound humiliation of my public surrender. She whispered a quiet word to her husband, recognizing that a minor concession would cement their absolute victory without causing any further administrative friction. Cameron arrogantly nodded, granting my pathetic request with a dismissive, patronizing wave of his hand. He coldly instructed the chief physician to delay the final termination protocols until exactly tomorrow morning. My son and his treacherous wife sharply turned on their expensive heels and confidently walked away down the long corridor, flanked securely by their private attorney. They left completely convinced they had decisively won the final battle. They remained unaware that my 24-hour window was precisely the time I needed to deploy Attorney Bradley and unleash catastrophic financial destruction upon them. I watched Cameron and Megan disappear down the sterile hospital corridor, their footsteps fading into the distance as they celebrated their perceived victory. They genuinely believed my tears were a display of absolute surrender. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my temporary retreat. The 24-hour window they so arrogantly granted me was not for mourning. It was the precise amount of time I required to entirely dismantle their stolen financial empire. I turned away from the glass window of the intensive care unit and walked briskly toward the secluded family waiting room at the end of the hall. I needed total privacy to execute the next phase of my retaliation. I sat down at a small laminate table in the corner and pulled my laptop from my leather briefcase. My hands did not tremble. The sadness I had projected only moments ago was completely replaced by a cold, calculating determination. I connected to the secure hospital network and immediately opened the encrypted dossier provided by my forensic accountants. The detailed financial map explicitly outlined Megan's aggressive acquisition of the controlling stake in the medical technology startup. She thought she had cleanly hidden my wife's stolen life savings behind layers of corporate shell companies. I initiated a high-priority encrypted video conference request, bypassing standard administrative channels. I directly contacted the private secure communication lines of the executive board of directors for the specific startup Megan had targeted. I utilized my archived corporate security credentials to force the urgent connection, a privilege I retained from my decades as a leading mechanical engineer. The screen flickered to life as three confused and highly irritated executives joined the digital meeting. They demanded to know how I bypassed their security firewall. I ignored their frantic complaints and flawlessly prepared my digital strike. I carefully addressed the three powerful board members staring back at me through the high-definition video feed. I introduced myself with absolute formal precision, stating my full legal name and my professional credentials. I calmly informed them that their newest primary investor, my daughter-in-law, had just purchased her massive controlling stake using entirely stolen capital. I shared my screen directly into the conference, displaying the undeniable forensic accounting report that flawlessly traced the laundered cash straight from my dying wife's medical fund into their corporate accounts. The chief executive officer scoffed loudly, attempting to dismiss my claims as a pathetic family dispute that held no legal bearing over their upcoming initial public offering. He arrogantly stated that the corporate transaction was completely finalized and legally binding, threatening to disconnect the call. I did not raise my voice or react to his dismissive attitude. Instead, I brought up a secondary document and displayed it for the entire board to review. I revealed a deeply buried, profoundly devastating hidden fact. I was not merely an aggrieved family member making wild accusations. I was the original primary mechanical engineer who personally designed and legally patented the exact core microscopic valve technology that their entire medical manufacturing company relied upon. I explained that I had leased the exclusive rights to a subsidiary corporation 15 years ago, a company they had recently acquired to build their flagship medical product. The board members suddenly grew incredibly quiet, their arrogant postures immediately dissolving into genuine panic as they recognized my name from the foundational patent filings. I controlled the literal lifeblood of their entire corporate valuation. I leaned forward, staring directly into the camera lens to ensure my absolute conviction was completely understood. I issued a strict, non-negotiable ultimatum to the executives. They were required to immediately void Megan's shares, entirely seizing her illicit financial stake under the federal statutes regarding criminal money laundering. I demanded they officially lock her out of their corporate structure and permanently freeze the stolen capital within the next hour. If they refused to comply with my precise demands, or if they attempted to warn her, I would legally revoke their exclusive patent license before the sun rose. I promised them I would file an immediate, devastating injunction that would completely halt their manufacturing process, obliterate their impending public offering, and entirely bankrupt their precious company by tomorrow morning. The absolute silence in the digital meeting room was immensely satisfying. The executives stared at the screen, fully comprehending that their entire financial future now rested entirely in my hands. The chief executive officer swallowed hard, his previous arrogance utterly destroyed by the monumental leverage I wielded over his life. They recognized I was perfectly willing to burn their entire corporation to ashes if they dared to protect my malicious daughter-in-law from facing my severe justice. I watched them nervously nod their heads in absolute submission to my unyielding authority, securing the total financial destruction of the woman who targeted my wife. The board of directors completely panicked, their faces pale as they scrambled to salvage their lucrative corporation. The chief executive officer quickly reversed his hostile tone and frantically assured me that my strict commands would be executed immediately. I remained on the secure connection just long enough to visually confirm the digital transfer. The executives swiftly isolated Megan's illicit financial portfolio, officially voiding her massive ownership stake and permanently freezing the stolen capital in a locked escrow account. I watched the confirmation screens populate, knowing that my daughter-in-law had just instantly lost her entire stolen empire. I closed the laptop, a profound sense of satisfaction washing over me. However, my momentary victory was abruptly interrupted by the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots marching directly down the sterile hospital hallway. Two large, heavily armed, uniformed police officers stepped confidently into the secluded ICU waiting room. They scanned the area with aggressive authority before locking their stern gaze directly onto me. I slowly closed my briefcase and stood up to politely address them, but they immediately raised their hands to halt my approach. The lead officer stepped forward and firmly demanded that I state my full legal name for the official record. When I calmly confirmed my identity, his expression hardened into an impenetrable mask of absolute legal authority. He unclipped a thick stack of certified court documents from his utility belt and sternly presented them to me. The officer explicitly stated that my son Cameron had just filed an extremely severe, highly fabricated domestic violence report against me at the local precinct. Cameron had viciously lied to a magistrate judge, claiming I had physically assaulted him in my living room and was actively threatening to murder his dying mother. Operating entirely on these carefully orchestrated, perjured statements, the judge had instantly granted Cameron a strict emergency zero-tolerance restraining order against me. The police officers explicitly commanded me to turn around, gather my personal belongings, and permanently vacate the hospital premises right now. They warned me that if I took a single step closer to my wife's room, I would be brutally handcuffed, criminally charged, and dragged to a concrete jail cell. My own treacherous son had successfully weaponized the entire local police force to physically banish me from Valerie's quiet deathbed, leaving him completely and utterly alone to quickly pull the plug without facing any immediate resistance. Megan and Cameron completely believed their flawless trap had snapped shut. They assumed Valerie was taking her final breaths in a lonely hospital room while I sat banished in the freezing city streets. To commemorate their perceived absolute victory, they rented out the most exclusive private dining room at the Apex, a five-star restaurant renowned for catering to the city's financial elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, arrogant glow over the long mahogany table. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos poured vintage champagne into towering crystal flutes. Megan sat near the head of the table wearing a custom designer gown paid for entirely by the funds she had ruthlessly siphoned from my wife's medical accounts. Cameron sat beside her, constantly checking his phone, likely waiting for the hospital to call and confirm his mother's permanent silence. He remained blissfully unaware that shadow creditors were currently tearing apart his empty apartment across town, actively hunting him to collect their massive debt. Tonight was entirely about Megan. She had invited 24 prominent local venture capitalists, aggressive hedge fund managers, and wealthy socialites to formally announce her grand entrance into the high-stakes technology sector. She intended to flaunt the massive controlling stake she believed she had successfully purchased in the medical startup. She reveled in the luxurious atmosphere, soaking up the admiring glances of her wealthy peers. The clinking of expensive crystal and the low hum of arrogant laughter filled the private room. They celebrated the brutal execution of an innocent woman and the destruction of a father completely blind to the reality that their entire empire had already been reduced to absolute ash hours prior. I stood in the dark hallway just outside the heavy oak doors, listening to their sickening, premature celebration unfold. I pushed them firmly wide open and entered. Megan stood proudly at the head of the massive dining table, gently tapping her manicured fingers against the edge of a crystal champagne flute. The sharp, ringing sound instantly commanded the complete attention of the powerful room. She offered a practiced, gleaming smile to the gathered financial elites and launched into a carefully rehearsed speech detailing her tremendous professional ascent. She brazenly described herself as a fierce, independent visionary who had tirelessly built her own wealth completely from scratch. She wove a compelling, entirely fictitious narrative about her keen business instincts, claiming she had strategically identified an undervalued medical technology startup and fearlessly risked her own personal capital to secure the controlling investment. The sheer hypocrisy of her words was astounding. She completely omitted the brutal reality that her entire financial foundation was built directly on top of my dying wife's stolen medical funds. She spoke eloquently about driving future healthcare innovations, masking her homicidal greed behind a veil of corporate philanthropy. Cameron watched her with absolute adoration, playing the role of the supportive husband while eagerly anticipating the massive financial windfall she was describing. When Megan finally concluded her passionate speech, the entire room erupted into a roaring round of applause. Wealthy venture capitalists raised their glasses high into the air, offering enthusiastic toasts to her remarkable self-made success. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room suddenly swung open, interrupting the final echoes of their resounding cheers. I walked calmly inside, completely shattering the pristine, luxurious atmosphere. I was not wearing an expensive designer tuxedo or a tailored silk tie. I deliberately wore the same faded gray canvas engineering suit I had worn for decades while physically building the exact structural patents they were currently celebrating. The stark, undeniable contrast between my worn appearance and the extravagant surroundings instantly unsettled the entire room. I held my right hand up tightly, grasping a small, polished silver flash drive between my fingers. The tiny device contained the complete, unredacted forensic accounting report, detailing every single fraudulent wire transfer Megan had executed. Cameron jumped out of his chair the exact second he recognized my face, his adoring expression instantly morphing into an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered panic. He realized his fraudulent restraining order had completely failed to break my spirit. Megan dropped her champagne flute onto the mahogany table, her confident posture crumbling as she stared in absolute horror at the silver drive I held. The elite guests lowered their glasses, their polite smiles fading into expressions of profound confusion. They exchanged nervous whispers, entirely bewildered by the sudden, shocking intrusion of a man who looked like a common blue-collar laborer, violently crashing their high society event. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional outbursts. I simply locked my hardened, unforgiving gaze directly onto my incredibly treacherous daughter-in-law, letting the overwhelming heavy silence stretch across the large dining room as the undeniable weight of her permanent financial destruction finally arrived exactly as I had promised. Cameron quickly recovered from his initial shock and desperately attempted to regain control of the narrative. He furiously snapped his fingers, aggressively signaling the two large restaurant security guards standing quietly near the entrance. He loudly demanded they immediately arrest me, explicitly shouting that I was a dangerous, mentally unstable trespasser violating an active police restraining order. The two muscular guards stepped forward in unison, reaching out to physically restrain my arms and forcefully drag me out of the private dining room. I did not flinch or attempt to fight them. Before their heavy hands could even graze the fabric of my faded suit, a commanding voice echoed sharply across the quiet room. The wealthiest, most influential venture capitalist sitting at the absolute center of the long mahogany table suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up. His name was Arthur Sterling, the primary financial architect behind the entire local technology sector, and a man whose absolute authority eclipsed everyone else in the room combined. He raised his right hand in a swift, authoritative gesture, silently ordering the two security guards to immediately halt their physical advance. The guards instantly froze in place, stepping back respectfully as Arthur walked directly toward me. Cameron grinned foolishly, assuming the powerful billionaire was stepping forward to personally handle the insane intruder ruining his wife's prestigious party. Instead, Arthur stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, lowered his head in a gesture of profound respect, and delivered a formal, deeply sincere bow. He looked me directly in the eyes and warmly addressed me as his original engineering mentor, the brilliant mind who had personally taught him everything he knew about structural innovation 40 years ago. He turned to the stunned crowd and loudly announced that I was the legendary inventor who held the absolute master patents for the microscopic valve technology Megan claimed to control. Arthur declared that my presence at this table was the greatest honor the room could possibly receive. The entire dining room instantly fell into a heavy, dead silence. Megan's jaw dropped in sheer terror, her fake empire completely disintegrating before her eyes. Cameron realized his ultimate nightmare had manifested right in front of him. The powerful men they intended to impress now looked at them with absolute disgust. The trap I engineered had finally snapped shut, locking my treacherous son inside an inescapable prison of his own making. Cameron's furious shouts shattered the stunned silence that had fallen over the luxurious private dining room. His face contorted in absolute rage, he lunged forward, screaming frantic demands at the frozen security guards to physically remove me from the premises immediately. I completely ignored his pathetic, desperate display. My focus remained entirely unbroken. Arthur Sterling remained standing respectfully to the side, his sharp eyes silently ordering the rest of the room to let me move freely. I turned my back on my treacherous son and walked directly toward the massive state-of-the-art media console positioned at the far end of the mahogany table. The restaurant staff had prepared a high-definition projection system for Megan's triumphant presentation. I intended to hijack that exact system to completely dismantle her stolen empire. I pulled the small, polished silver flash drive from my pocket. My hands moved with the precise, practiced mechanical efficiency I had honed over decades of engineering. I bypassed the standard user interface and directly plugged the drive into the primary auxiliary port of the central control module. A digital prompt instantly flashed across the massive wall-mounted screen requesting access authorization. I tapped the console interface, initiating the automatic execution protocol I had pre-programmed earlier that afternoon. The elegant, ambient classical music playing through the restaurant's overhead speakers abruptly cut off, replaced by the sharp static hiss of raw audio. Cameron sprinted down the length of the long table, desperately trying to reach the console to rip the drive from the port. He realized the absolute catastrophe about to unfold. I simply stepped aside, knowing the execution protocol was completely irreversible. The massive screen flickered brightly, instantly overriding the digital menu and casting a harsh light across the horrified faces of the prestigious financial elite gathered inside the private room tonight. The unedited security footage I had meticulously extracted from my hidden home surveillance network exploded onto the massive high-definition screen. The crystal-clear video immediately displayed the interior of my private living room, capturing the exact, undeniable moment of ultimate betrayal. Every wealthy investor in the room gasped collectively as the footage showed Megan forcefully standing over Valerie's frail, helpless body. The high-quality audio captured every single malicious whisper echoing from the digital speakers. The entire elite dining room watched in absolute paralyzed horror as Megan aggressively shoved the lethal, unregulated black market pills deep down her dying mother-in-law's throat. Megan's own cruel, calculating voice, explicitly detailing her homicidal intention to expedite Valerie's demise, filled the silent restaurant space, permanently destroying her meticulously fabricated public persona. Before the shocked audience could even process the sheer magnitude of her sociopathic violence, the security footage seamlessly transitioned to the next undeniable piece of catastrophic evidence. The screen now displayed my home office, clearly showing Cameron aggressively attacking my secure wall safe. The venture capitalists watched in utter disgust as my son wielded a heavy steel crowbar, brutally smashing the locking mechanism to pieces. He blindly followed his wife's criminal directives, destroying the heavy steel door to steal the vital medical documents inside. The investors who had just spent the entire evening applauding Megan's brilliant business acumen were completely repulsed by the pathetic, thuggish reality of their actual operations. I did not give them a single second to recover from the visual assault. The video feed immediately dissolved, instantly replaced by the heavily encrypted comprehensive forensic accounting report I had commissioned earlier. The meticulous financial dossier completely dominated the screen, highlighting exactly how Megan's entire controlling investment had been funded. Brilliant red lines traced the stolen capital directly from Valerie's emergency medical trust fund, mapping its illicit journey through 3 separate offshore shell corporations, and finally depositing the laundered cash directly into the medical technology startup corporate accounts. The bold, undeniable text on the screen proved with absolute legal certainty that Megan's entire portfolio was built entirely on stolen blood money. Her self-made narrative was a complete manufactured lie. She was not a brilliant tech visionary. She was a ruthless, calculating criminal who had literally poisoned an innocent dying woman specifically to steal her life savings and illegally purchase her way into high society. The incontrovertible evidence hung heavily over the mahogany table, completely suffocating the room. Megan stood entirely frozen at the head of the table, her face drained of all color, staring blankly at the massive screen projecting her unforgivable crimes to the most powerful financial titans in the city. Cameron collapsed backward into a leather chair, violently trembling as he fully realized the catastrophic magnitude of my calculated retaliation. The elite guests instinctively pulled their chairs away from the disgraced couple, actively distancing their own prestigious reputations from the toxic fallout of Megan's destroyed empire. I stood quietly near the console, watching my irrefutable truth systematically dismantle their stolen lives completely. Arthur Sterling turned slowly away from the towering projection screen, his commanding presence radiating absolute revulsion. He looked directly at Megan, his eyes narrowed with profound, chilling disgust. With a voice that carried the heavy, undeniable authority of a true industry titan, he formally addressed the silent dining room. He publicly and permanently severed every single business tie with her fabricated enterprise. He explicitly instructed his extensive network of attending venture capitalists to immediately blacklist her name from every financial institution in the state. In a matter of mere seconds, the immense corporate stock portfolio Megan had so viciously stolen from my wife's medical fund became completely and entirely worthless. Her newly built, untouchable empire evaporated into nothingness right before her eyes. The guests began to aggressively murmur their collective outrage, amplifying the suffocating tension inside the luxurious private space. Just as Megan opened her mouth to frantically plead her case, a sudden jarring electronic sound violently sliced through the heavy atmosphere. Cameron's personal cell phone began ringing loudly from the inner pocket of his tailored designer jacket. The sharp, persistent tone echoed relentlessly, completely shattering the remaining silence. Cameron's hands shook uncontrollably as he reached inside his coat, entirely paralyzed by his escalating terror. His trembling fingers accidentally engaged the phone's external speaker feature as he fumbled to reject the incoming call. A harsh, deeply menacing voice immediately blared through the device's digital speaker, amplified perfectly across the quiet mahogany table. The notorious underground loan shark did not offer any polite introductions. His cold, unforgiving words struck Cameron like a physical blow. The shadow creditor explicitly informed my treacherous son that they had thoroughly inspected the fraudulent suburban house deed he used as collateral. The criminal enforcer calmly stated that the massive high-interest loan was now officially in default. He delivered a strict, absolutely terrifying final ultimatum that permanently sealed Cameron's fate. He gave my son exactly 3 hours to physically deliver $600,000 in untraceable cash, or he was a dead man. The line abruptly disconnected, leaving a hollow, echoing tone in the room. Cameron stared blankly at his phone, his breathing incredibly shallow, finally realizing the lethal predators he invited into his life were already actively hunting him down. My elaborate trap was now flawlessly executed. The absolute irreversible destruction of my highly arrogant son was finally and completely in full motion here tonight. The massive high-definition screen in the private dining room continued to cast a harsh, unforgiving glare over the ruined celebration. The elite venture capitalists and wealthy socialites did not linger to offer condolences or demand further explanations. They moved with the swift, synchronized efficiency of predators recognizing a tainted carcass. They grabbed their expensive coats and designer handbags, abandoning the mahogany table in absolute disgust. Nobody looked back at my son or his wife. The crystal champagne flutes remained full and untouched. The extravagant 5-star dinner transformed instantly into a desolate graveyard of their shattered ambitions. I stood silently near the media console, watching the utter evaporation of their meticulously fabricated high society status. Arthur Sterling was the final guest to depart. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, cast one final look of pure, unadulterated revulsion toward Megan, and walked out the heavy oak doors without uttering a single syllable. The heavy doors swung shut with a resounding thud, sealing Cameron and Megan inside the echoing, empty space. The deafening silence was broken only by the sharp, persistent buzzing of the projector system above them. They stood completely alone amidst the luxurious ruins of their completely eradicated empire. Megan stared blankly at the empty chairs, her hands violently trembling as the catastrophic reality finally pierced her arrogant delusion. Her entire stolen fortune was frozen. Her professional reputation was permanently obliterated. She possessed absolutely zero leverage, zero influence, and zero allies in a city she had desperately tried to conquer. Cameron remained paralyzed beside his chair, his breathing ragged and shallow as the loan shark's lethal ultimatum echoed endlessly in his panicked mind. They were completely stripped of their stolen wealth, their manufactured prestige, and their arrogant pride. The illusion of their supremacy was entirely dismantled. Megan violently shattered the suffocating silence. She grabbed a crystal champagne flute and hurled it blindly against the expensive mahogany wall paneling. The glass exploded into 1,000 glittering fragments, mirroring the absolute destruction of her meticulously planned future. She completely lost all remaining composure, her carefully constructed mask of sophisticated elegance immediately melting away to reveal the terrified, vicious opportunist hiding underneath. She turned her furious gaze toward her husband, her face flushed with unhinged rage. She screamed at Cameron with a volume that visibly rattled the heavy wooden doors, aggressively blaming his sheer incompetence for their current catastrophic predicament. She viciously mocked his failing technology startup, loudly declaring that his pathetic inability to secure legitimate venture capital had forced her to take desperate measures. She relentlessly attacked his character, brutally humiliating him for dragging them into a lethal $600,000 debt with ruthless underground criminals. She desperately attempted to rewrite their shared criminal history right in front of me, aggressively claiming she had merely followed his manipulative financial directives to secure their future. Cameron abruptly snapped out of his paralyzed stupor, entirely unwilling to absorb the blame for a homicidal scheme she had primarily engineered. His profound panic instantly transformed into a desperate feral hostility. He lunged across the empty space between them, his face mere inches from hers, projecting absolute venom. He loudly refused to carry the burden of her sociopathic ambition. In his desperate attempt to deflect the impending legal and physical destruction heading his way, Cameron completely abandoned any remaining loyalty to his wife. Two senior restaurant managers and a private security guard cautiously pushed open the oak doors to investigate the shattered glass, stepping directly into the chaotic crossfire. Cameron immediately weaponized their sudden presence. He pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at Megan's chest and screamed the ultimate truth for the staff to hear. He explicitly declared that Megan was the singular mastermind who had illegally purchased the unregulated synthetic toxins from the dark web. He loudly confessed that she was the one who had intentionally and maliciously poisoned my innocent wife, completely absolving himself of the physical administration of the lethal drugs. He desperately threw his wife directly to the wolves, hoping to somehow trade her freedom for his own survival. Megan shrieked in absolute terror, lunging forward to physically strike his face. Their once unified, arrogant marriage instantly disintegrated into a toxic, violent war of mutual destruction. They viciously tore each other apart in the center of the ruined dining room, frantically exchanging terrifying criminal confessions and brutal accusations as the horrified restaurant staff quickly pulled out their smartphones to record the entire explosive confrontation. They were actively building their own indisputable criminal prosecution cases against one another. The unified front they had so proudly displayed in the hospital corridor was permanently shattered. I watched them eagerly devour each other like starving animals, perfectly content to let their inherent malice handle the initial phase of their inevitable, completely justified imprisonment. The chaotic spectacle unfolding within the private dining room no longer required my direct supervision. Cameron and Megan were completely consumed by their own frantic desperation, actively destroying whatever pathetic remnants of their lives still existed. I quietly disconnected my silver flash drive from the media console, securing the irrefutable digital evidence safely back inside my jacket pocket. I turned my back on the violent, screaming match and smoothly exited the restaurant through a secluded side door, completely bypassing the gathering crowd of curious patrons and shocked employees. The freezing night air washed over me as I stepped into the quiet, dimly lit alleyway behind the luxurious building. My smartphone buzzed softly in my pocket, signaling an incoming encrypted text message. I pulled the device out and quickly opened the secure communication from Attorney Bradley. The glowing text on the small screen delivered a massive wave of profound, unparalleled relief directly into my chest. The chief physician had successfully administered the entire dosage of the experimental antidote without any administrative interference. Bradley's message confirmed the miraculous medical reality. Valerie's resilient biological systems had aggressively responded to the chemical neutralizer. The synthetic poison had been completely dismantled. Her vital organs were rapidly stabilizing, and she was actively waking up from her deep coma. My wife had successfully survived their cowardly homicidal assassination attempt. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, allowing a single breath of pure gratitude to escape my lungs. However, Bradley's subsequent message instantly pulled my focus directly back to the active battlefield. He attached a highly urgent real-time location ping generated by his private investigators. The ruthless underground loan sharks had not wasted any time idly searching the city for their missing capital. They had successfully tracked Cameron's digital footprint directly to the Apex restaurant, but they were executing a far more sinister, calculated ambush. The shadow creditors knew Cameron would eventually panic and attempt to flee back to his mother's bedside to secure his forged medical proxy. They were currently sitting inside two unmarked, heavily tinted vehicles, parked deep in the shadows of the hospital parking lot, patiently waiting to physically intercept him the exact second he arrived. Cameron was desperately racing straight toward a brutal, violent reckoning, completely unaware that his impending arrival would be greeted by merciless enforcers ready to permanently and violently collect his massive outstanding debt. Cameron and Megan burst through the rear exit of the luxury restaurant, their expensive evening wear completely disheveled as they frantically sprinted across the damp pavement toward their parked vehicle. Panic dictated their every erratic movement. The crushing realization that their entire financial kingdom had collapsed left them with only one desperate final gambit. Cameron aggressively shoved his key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life as he recklessly slammed the accelerator. He maneuvered the car through the heavy city traffic with dangerous, erratic swerves, blowing through red lights in a singular blind rush toward the Central Medical Complex. Megan sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her manicured hands gripping the dashboard. They rapidly formulated a profoundly wicked contingency plan during the chaotic drive. Since my emergency pharmaceutical intervention had successfully neutralized the poison, they knew Valerie was actively waking up from her deep coma. They intended to weaponize her fragile, disoriented state immediately upon arrival. Cameron planned to physically isolate his mother in the intensive care unit using his fraudulent medical proxy to block any nurses from entering. Megan would then forcefully guide Valerie's trembling hand to sign a completely legitimate, legally binding property transfer document, officially signing over the absolute rights to her remaining suburban estate and private investment accounts. They believed they could quickly secure this fresh capital, satisfy the looming underground debt, and salvage their miserable lives before the authorities caught up with their extensive forgery. Their entire survival strategy hinged on reaching her hospital bed before I could intercept them. They pulled into the massive concrete parking garage of the city hospital, the tires screeching loudly against the smooth pavement as Cameron recklessly parked the speeding vehicle inside the empty stall. They felt entirely safe from my immediate retaliation here in the dark facility. The moment Cameron pushed open his heavy car door, the suffocating silence of the concrete parking structure was violently shattered. 3 massive, heavily tattooed enforcers materialized from the deep shadows behind a concrete pillar, completely blocking their singular path to the hospital elevators. The underground loan sharks had flawlessly predicted Cameron's desperate, panicked retreat. The lead enforcer did not utter a single warning before launching his brutal assault. He stepped forward and viciously drove a heavy steel baton directly into Cameron's ribcage. The sickening crunch of fracturing bone echoed loudly across the empty parking deck as my son instantly collapsed onto his knees, gasping frantically for oxygen. The other 2 syndicate thugs immediately swarmed him, delivering a rapid, merciless sequence of heavy kicks to his stomach and jaw. They demanded the absolute immediate repayment of their stolen $600,000, treating his designer suit like a worthless rag. Cameron raised his bloody hands, desperately pleading for mercy while helplessly sobbing on the filthy concrete floor. Megan stood completely paralyzed beside the passenger door, witnessing the horrifying, brutal reality of their immense financial failure. The profound loyalty she had so proudly projected inside the luxurious restaurant instantly dissolved into absolute self-preservation. When the lead enforcer momentarily turned his aggressive focus toward her, demanding she surrender her expensive diamond jewelry as a minor down payment, she made her ultimate cowardly decision. Megan did not scream for help or attempt to shield her bleeding husband. Instead, she forcefully threw her designer handbag directly at the enforcer's face to create a momentary distraction. She kicked off her high heels and sprinted away in pure, unfiltered terror, completely abandoning Cameron to be severely beaten in the darkness. She recklessly darted toward the brightly lit emergency lobby, entirely focused on saving her own pathetic life. The violent assault in the parking garage lasted exactly 4 grueling minutes before the loan sharks finally retreated, promising to return tomorrow to collect the rest of his flesh if the money remained unpaid. Cameron eventually dragged his battered, broken body across the cold pavement, leaving a thin trail of fresh blood behind him. He limped agonizingly into the main hospital building, leaning heavily against the sterile walls for physical support. His jaw was entirely swollen and his breathing was incredibly shallow, but his sociopathic greed continued to furiously drive him forward. He desperately crawled into the ascending elevator and pressed the button for the intensive care unit, foolishly believing he could still force his waking mother to sign the vital property deeds to satisfy the ruthless criminals outside. He stumbled off the elevator and staggered painfully down the long, bright corridor toward Valerie's private room. However, his ultimate devastating defeat was already waiting for him. Instead of finding a vulnerable, defenseless woman alone in a quiet hospital bed, Cameron found 3 heavily armed, uniformed police officers standing firmly shoulder to shoulder, forming an absolute, impenetrable barricade directly across his mother's doorway. His homicidal trap had finally imploded entirely today. The 3 formidable police officers did not grant Cameron a single moment to process his absolute failure. As he collapsed weakly against the pristine hospital corridor wall, bleeding heavily onto the linoleum, the commanding officer swiftly stepped forward and loudly announced his immediate arrest. I had thoroughly utilized the irrefutable digital surveillance footage of Cameron destroying my secure wall safe to swiftly combat his fraudulent domestic violence claims. Attorney Bradley presented this overwhelming, undeniable evidence directly to the magistrate judge earlier that evening. Confronted with absolute proof of Cameron's aggressive perjury and explicit criminal intent, the furious judge immediately revoked the fabricated restraining order and instantly issued an emergency warrant for my son's immediate arrest. The officers ruthlessly secured Cameron's bruised wrists behind his back, clamping the heavy steel handcuffs over his swollen joints. They formally read him his rights, explicitly charging him with severe elder abuse, grand financial forgery, and massive criminal perjury. Cameron sobbed uncontrollably as the officers physically dragged him away from his mother's room, dragging his broken body toward a concrete holding cell where his underground creditors could easily locate him. While Cameron was violently hauled away to face his bleak reality, his treacherous wife was simultaneously colliding with her own catastrophic dead end across the city. Megan had sprinted entirely out of the hospital, frantically hailing a random taxicab to transport her directly to the international airport terminal. She fully intended to completely abandon her beaten husband and permanently flee the country to escape my severe retaliation. She desperately purchased a one-way ticket to a non-extradition jurisdiction using a concealed offshore credit card she had kept hidden from everyone. She nervously approached the final security checkpoint, believing she had successfully outsmarted the impending legal consequences. However, her passport had already been digitally flagged by federal authorities based on the explosive money laundering intelligence Bradley had seamlessly forwarded to the Financial Crimes Division. The exact second Megan proudly handed her passport to the customs agent, bright red alarms blared across the entire security terminal. 5 heavily armed federal agents immediately swarmed her location, forcefully tackling her to the polished airport floor. They tightly handcuffed her trembling wrists, loudly charging her with international money laundering and attempted homicide. The magnificent, impenetrable cage I had meticulously engineered over the past 24 hours was now completely locked. My enemies were entirely vanquished, and my beloved wife was finally safe and awake. The harsh, bright fluorescent light of the cold municipal police precinct hummed relentlessly overhead, casting pale clinical shadows across the scratched metal table in the center of the interrogation room. I sat perfectly upright in a rigid, uncomfortable plastic chair, wearing my faded gray engineering suit, completely comfortable within the suffocating silence of the concrete walls. Attorney Bradley had smoothly orchestrated my temporary access to this restricted holding area, leveraging our impeccable cooperation with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. 2 burly correctional officers physically escorted my son into the windowless room. Cameron stumbled forward, dragging his feet. His designer jacket was torn and heavily stained with dried blood from the brutal parking garage assault. His right eye was swollen completely shut, surrounded by dark purple and yellow bruising, and his fractured jaw hung slightly askew. The officers forcefully pushed him into the chair directly across from me and securely locked his steel handcuffs to the heavy iron ring bolted to the center of the table. They immediately exited, firmly locking the solid door behind them and leaving us completely alone in the chilling silence. Cameron refused to look at me initially. He stared down at his battered, trembling hands, taking shallow, agonizing breaths that caused his fractured ribcage to visibly spasm. The arrogant, triumphant predator who had viciously commandeered my wife's intensive care unit room just hours ago was entirely gone. The man sitting across from me was a pathetic, broken shell, violently stripped of his stolen wealth and his manufactured supremacy. He was finally facing the absolute reality of his actions without any legal loopholes or deceitful, manipulative spouses to shield him. I did not offer a single solitary word of comfort. I simply waited for him to speak to me. Cameron finally lifted his battered head, tears streaming down his bruised face, pooling in the deep cuts along his jawline. He began to weep openly, a pathetic, desperate display entirely devoid of genuine remorse. He did not apologize for attempting to systematically poison his own mother. He did not ask if Valerie had successfully survived the brutal chemical assault they had orchestrated. Instead, he violently slammed his bound hands against the metal table, the steel chains rattling loudly in the quiet room. He begged me for immediate financial salvation. He frantically sobbed that the underground loan sharks were completely merciless. He claimed they held extensive criminal networks inside the state penitentiary system, explicitly threatening to have him brutally murdered in his cell if he failed to produce the $600,000. He pleaded with me to liquidate my remaining investment portfolios, desperately demanding I pay off his massive illicit debt to spare his life. He promised he would permanently disappear if I simply utilized my vast corporate resources to rescue him from his impending execution. I remained perfectly still, watching his frantic emotional manipulation crash uselessly against my absolute composure. I did not blink. I slowly opened the leather briefcase resting by my feet and withdrew a single heavy corporate document housed inside a protective plastic sleeve. I deliberately slid the manila folder across the scratched steel surface, stopping it exactly 1 inch from his trembling fingertips. Cameron stared at the sealed paperwork, utterly confused by my cold, methodical response. I instructed him to carefully read the primary corporate registration page. His swollen eye darted across the black text, struggling to process the complex legal terminology. I decided to directly verbalize the ultimate devastating truth. I calmly explained that 15 years ago I had intentionally established a highly secure, completely insulated financial shell corporation specifically designed to quietly manage my high-risk offshore venture capital investments. I actively utilized layers of anonymous proxy directors and completely unlisted holding companies to completely detach my personal identity from its aggressive lending operations. I leaned slightly forward, making absolute terrifying eye contact with my weeping son. I explicitly revealed that the notorious, ruthless underground lending firm he had so desperately sought out to illegally finance his failing technology startup was entirely owned and operated by the Pierce Industrial Trust. The shadow creditors he feared were my direct employees. Cameron stopped breathing. He stared at me in absolute horrified disbelief as my words permanently shattered his entire understanding of reality. He realized the violent enforcers in the parking garage had not acted independently. They were merely executing the strict collection protocols I had personally mandated for all fraudulent defaults. I had controlled the very source of his stolen capital from the absolute beginning. He had walked directly into my snare, completely blinded by his insatiable greed. The massive $600,000 he currently owed was actual money he had literally borrowed directly from his own biological father. My meticulous trap was absolutely inescapable. Cameron sat completely paralyzed within the sterile interrogation room, his fractured jaw trembling as the horrifying reality thoroughly dismantled his fragile psychological state. He had arrogantly believed he was outsmarting an obsolete old man when he handed the fraudulent property deed to the shadow creditors. He now profoundly understood the colossal magnitude of his unforgivable error. He had literally borrowed $600,000 directly from his own father, utilizing a completely fabricated legal document to unknowingly defraud his own family's massive corporate entity. The entire illicit debt was a meticulously orchestrated, highly sophisticated trap I had deliberately set to legally capture his insatiable greed. By actively pledging a fraudulent asset to secure capital from the Pierce Industrial Trust's underground subsidiary, Cameron had unknowingly crossed the strict threshold from local elder abuse into severe federal financial crime. Attorney Bradley had already submitted the undeniable paper trail directly to the federal prosecutors. Cameron was no longer facing a simple domestic dispute. He was facing decades inside a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive corporate fraud, grand larceny, and wire manipulation entirely disconnected from Megan's separate money laundering charges. His treacherous wife could not save him. His stolen money was completely eradicated, and his physical safety inside the prison system was now entirely dictated by the exact same corporate entity he had so foolishly attempted to defraud. He possessed absolutely zero leverage. The terrifying syndicate he profoundly feared was simply a highly regulated division of my own immense financial portfolio, operating perfectly within the incredibly strict parameters of my carefully orchestrated retaliation. I calmly stood up from the rigid plastic chair, buttoned my faded gray engineering suit, and smoothly picked up my leather briefcase. I did not require any further confessions or pathetic apologies. The trap had successfully executed its absolute purpose. Cameron slowly processed the sheer hopelessness of his permanent destruction. He violently dropped his heavy, bruised head directly onto the scratched metal table, his bloody cheek pressing against the cold steel surface as he sobbed in absolute total defeat. I firmly knocked on the heavy iron door, signaling the correctional officers to let me out. I confidently walked away without ever looking back, returning to a wife who was finally awake and a life completely cleansed of their toxic greed. How will you apply this strategy of setting clear, unyielding boundaries to protect your own fundamental well-being in future conflicts? I stepped out of the freezing concrete hallway and silently entered the adjacent observation room. A massive two-way mirror dominated the center of the wall, providing a flawless view directly into the second interrogation chamber. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as I stood beside the lead federal investigator. Megan sat at the center of the scratched metal table, her expensive designer gown completely ruined and hanging off her shoulders in dirty, torn layers. She had spent the entire car ride from the airport frantically constructing a desperate, entirely fabricated narrative to save her own pathetic life. She violently wiped fake tears from her eyes, aggressively deploying her most practiced look of profound, victimized terror. Two seasoned detectives sat across from her, their faces entirely neutral as they recorded her frantic testimony. Megan launched into a highly theatrical, flawlessly delivered performance. She vehemently claimed that Cameron was a dangerously abusive, violently controlling husband who had ruthlessly forced her into absolute compliance. She painted herself as a terrified, helpless hostage trapped inside a toxic marriage completely stripped of her own free will. She aggressively lied to the federal agents, loudly insisting that she had absolutely zero knowledge of the illicit money laundering operations or the stolen corporate funds. She shamelessly weaponized genuine domestic abuse survival narratives to shield her own sociopathic greed. She practically hyperventilated dramatically, clutching her chest, while stating that Cameron had explicitly threatened to physically destroy her if she dared to contact the authorities. She intended to completely sacrifice her beaten husband, dumping the entirety of their massive criminal enterprise squarely onto his broken shoulders. I watched her desperate manipulation unfold with absolute cold precision. She truly believed her very wealthy, sophisticated victim routine would successfully manipulate the criminal justice system and grant her absolute legal immunity immediately. Megan leaned aggressively forward across the scratched metal table, desperately attempting to solidify her fabricated innocence. She stared directly into the lead detective's eyes, dramatically insisting that Cameron had explicitly ordered her to administer the lethal black market narcotics to his dying mother. She sobbed violently, claiming her husband had meticulously orchestrated the entire homicidal scheme to aggressively expedite his massive financial inheritance. She vehemently stated that she had simply followed his terrifying domestic commands, fearing he would physically destroy her if she ever refused his sociopathic directives. Her performance was incredibly convincing, meticulously designed to legally establish Cameron as the solitary mastermind behind the gruesome medical assassination attempt. The two federal detectives continued writing their detailed notes, allowing her desperate perjury to completely fill the silent interrogation chamber. Before Megan could successfully finalize her treacherous legal maneuver, the heavy steel door suddenly swung wide open. Attorney Bradley strode confidently into the sterile concrete room, wearing his impeccably tailored charcoal suit and projecting absolute, unwavering legal authority. He completely ignored Megan's tearful, bewildered expression. He walked directly toward the center of the interrogation table and firmly placed a sleek digital tablet onto the cold steel surface. The federal detectives immediately leaned back, granting Bradley the floor. He tapped the glowing glass screen once, instantly initiating the encrypted audio playback sequence I had successfully captured via my hidden living room surveillance network. The pristine, high-definition audio recording immediately blasted through the tablet's powerful internal speakers, filling the tiny room with indisputable criminal evidence. Megan's own arrogant, highly recognizable voice echoed loudly against the concrete walls. The crystal-clear audio vividly captured her gleefully bragging to Cameron about successfully purchasing the untraceable, heart-stopping synthetic drugs directly from a notorious dark web pharmaceutical vendor. The recording explicitly detailed her own meticulous, cold-blooded plan to personally bypass the hospital security protocols and forcefully poison Valerie without triggering any standard toxicological alarms. The federal agents listened intently as the recorded Megan proudly described her brilliant, murderous strategy, viciously laughing about securing my wife's vast fortune. The overwhelming audio completely obliterated her fragile, victimized facade. Megan instantly stopped crying. Her mouth hung open in absolute paralyzed horror as she listened to her own undeniable voice enthusiastically confessing to the entire violent conspiracy. The digital recording definitively proved she was not a helpless, abused hostage following terrifying domestic orders. She was the primary, ruthless architect of the entire assassination plot. Bradley stopped the audio playback, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence to crush her remaining spirit. The lead homicide detective slowly closed his heavy notepad, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated disgust. He stood up from his rigid plastic chair, towering over the terrified woman. He formally announced that her previous criminal statements were officially classified as aggressive perjury. He explicitly informed Megan that based entirely on this newly provided highly conclusive audio evidence, her preliminary charges were immediately being upgraded. She was no longer facing mere money laundering indictments. She was officially charged with premeditated, extremely violent attempted first-degree murder. Megan continued staring blankly at the sleek digital screen, her entire arrogant universe violently collapsing into absolute, irrevocable ruin. The sheer magnitude of her profound failure finally crushed her fragile psychological defenses completely. She slowly lowered her head onto the cold metal table, weeping silently as she comprehensively realized her luxurious life was entirely over. She would spend the remainder of her miserable existence locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of her stolen wealth, her fabricated social prestige, and her deceitful freedom. The federal agents physically hoisted her from the plastic chair, escorting her directly toward the processing center to systematically execute her formal booking procedures. Down the sterile hallway, Cameron endured the exact same humiliating fate officially processed into the massive, unforgiving criminal justice system. They were finally locked away, permanently isolated from the innocent people they had so viciously targeted. I turned away from the heavy observation window, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute closure settling deep within my chest. I smoothly navigated the busy, echoing corridors of the municipal police precinct, walking with the quiet, undeniable confidence of a man who had successfully conquered an incredible darkness. I pushed open the heavy glass entrance doors and stepped outside into the crisp, refreshing morning air. The bright golden sun was steadily rising over the towering city skyline, casting a warm, brilliant light across the waking metropolis. The immediate lethal threat against my beloved family was permanently neutralized, entirely dismantled by my own unwavering strategic retaliation. Valerie was safely resting inside her heavily guarded hospital room, surrounded by dedicated medical professionals and entirely free from their toxic influence. My son and his wife were decisively incarcerated, facing decades of severe punishment for their sociopathic greed. I took a deep, steadying breath, allowing the gentle morning breeze to wash over my faded engineering suit. My flawless trap had functioned with absolute perfection, legally neutralizing the vicious predators who had arrogantly attempted to destroy my home. I calmly walked down the concrete steps, completely ready to finally return to my fiercely healing wife and rebuild our beautiful, peaceful life together without ever looking back. My meticulous, calculated retaliation was officially complete. Every single variable had been rigorously tested, and the optimal outcome was undeniably achieved. I smiled softly to myself, firmly knowing that our precious twilight years would now remain eternally undisturbed by their unforgivable toxic venom. The morning sun completely illuminated the hospital corridors as I walked back through the heavy glass doors of the intensive care unit. The sterile scent of antiseptic no longer carried the overwhelming weight of impending loss. It now represented the ultimate sanctuary of our truly magnificent victory. I navigated the familiar maze of clinical white hallways wearing my faded gray engineering suit proudly. 2 uniformed police officers stood firmly at attention outside the designated private hospital room. They instantly recognized me, offering a silent nod of profound respect before stepping aside to grant me immediate access. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped quietly across the threshold. The harsh, rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors had been completely silenced. The intimidating labyrinth of intravenous tubes and heavy respiratory equipment was entirely gone. Valerie was sitting upright against a stack of crisp white hospital pillows. Her face was undeniably pale, and deep shadows lingered heavily beneath her warm brown eyes, but she was completely, undeniably lucid. The sheer magnitude of this miraculous reality momentarily paralyzed me near the doorway. She slowly turned her head toward the sound of my entrance. A soft, incredibly familiar smile instantly broke across her tired features, completely erasing the horrible, suffocating nightmare of the past 24 hours. She did not look like a helpless victim waiting to be discarded by her treacherous family. She possessed the quiet, unbreakable strength of a woman who had successfully survived a meticulously planned assassination attempt. I walked slowly toward the side of her mechanical bed, completely overwhelmed by the profound depth of her resilience. The toxic predators who sought to extinguish her light were currently rotting inside federal holding cells, while my beautiful, brilliant wife was actively reclaiming her stolen life right in front of my eyes. I gently sat on the edge of the mattress and reached forward carefully, wrapping my arms around her fragile shoulders. We shared a quiet, profoundly deep embrace, allowing the overwhelming magnitude of our ultimate survival to wash over us completely. I buried my face into her neck, feeling the steady, reassuring pulse of her beating heart against my chest. She held me incredibly tightly, her physical grip surprisingly strong for someone who had just escaped the brink of permanent darkness. When we finally pulled back, I gently cupped her face in my hands, silently promising her that the terrifying ordeal was entirely over. Valerie looked directly into my eyes, her expression hardening into absolute, unwavering clarity. She did not require any comforting lies or soft explanations. She immediately revealed a crucial, previously unknown detail regarding the exact moment of the brutal assassination attempt. Her voice was remarkably steady as she calmly explained that her sharp biological instincts had never truly faded during her prolonged hospitalization. She vividly remembered the exact moment Megan had forcefully hovered over her bed, aggressively shoving those illicit synthetic capsules deep into her dry mouth. Valerie explicitly detailed how the harsh, fiercely metallic taste of the unregulated black market narcotics had instantly triggered a massive internal alarm. She absolutely knew her treacherous relative was intentionally delivering a lethal dose of unauthorized poison. Valerie possessed the sheer, incredible presence of mind to actively feign total compliance. She perfectly simulated a deep, exhausted swallow, effectively convincing Megan that the deadly synthetic chemicals were successfully ingested. The exact second the heavy wooden door clicked shut and Megan smugly locked her inside the private room, Valerie immediately sprang into desperate survival mode. She aggressively coughed the lethal capsules back up violently, spitting the vast majority of the toxic medication directly into the hidden folds of her white cotton pillowcase. She deliberately concealed the damp, heavily stained fabric beneath her heavy blankets to perfectly maintain the illusion of complete physical capitulation. Although a tiny, unavoidable fraction of the potent synthetic compound had managed to enter her fragile bloodstream, causing her sudden physiological crash and the subsequent terrifying medical emergency, her brilliant split-second tactical deception had effectively prevented a massive instantaneous cardiac arrest. Her incredibly sharp instincts and remarkable situational awareness had successfully kept her breathing just long enough for me to forcefully breach the heavily barricaded hospital room and rapidly administer the vital experimental antidote. She had fundamentally engineered her own miraculous survival right under their incredibly arrogant noses. I listened to her astounding confession with absolute profound awe. My beautiful wife was not merely a passive victim waiting helplessly in the dark. She was a brilliant, incredibly resilient tactical survivor who had actively outsmarted two vicious sociopathic predators. We sat together in the quiet hospital room, our hands tightly intertwined, completely unified in our incredible triumph. The toxic offspring who had so foolishly underestimated our collective strength were currently facing total, irreversible annihilation. Our family legacy was fully secured. The attending chief physician entered the private room shortly after our emotional reunion. He carried a thick medical chart and offered a warm, highly encouraging smile. He formally verified Valerie rapidly stabilizing vital signs and cautiously suggested beginning a rigorous, structured regimen of intensive physical therapy. He gently recommended she remain comfortably hidden away inside the secure hospital bed for several more weeks to ensure her complete physiological recovery. Valerie listened politely to his conservative medical advice, but she immediately shook her head in absolute, unwavering refusal. The incredibly fierce, independent spirit that had kept her breathing during the terrifying chemical attack completely rejected the passive concept of prolonged isolation. She adamantly refused to hide away like a broken, fragile invalid while the legal system dismantled the sociopathic criminals who had actively attempted to extinguish her life. She looked directly at the stunned physician and firmly demanded a specialized transport wheelchair immediately. The doctor hesitated, citing her extreme physical exhaustion, but my wife's ironclad determination entirely overwhelmed his clinical objections. Valerie explicitly declared her unyielding intention to personally attend the upcoming federal sentencing hearing. She was completely unwilling to let written affidavits or proxy attorneys represent her profound survival. She fiercely resolved to physically roll directly into that crowded judicial courtroom, proudly demonstrating her unbreakable resilience to the entire world. She wanted to look her treacherous, murderous daughter-in-law straight in the eyes when the unforgiving federal judge finally handed down the maximum punitive sentence. She intended to deliver her visceral, incredibly powerful victim impact statement directly from her own mouth, completely shattering Megan's pathetic, fabricated victim narrative. I stood proudly behind her mechanical bed, placing a reassuring hand on her fragile shoulder as she verbally commanded the room. Valerie was no longer the helpless, dying matriarch our greedy son had so arrogantly attempted to erase. She had brilliantly transformed into a formidable, completely unstoppable force of absolute retribution. The medical staff frantically scrambled to fulfill her explicit, unwavering demands. We were actively preparing to deliver the absolute devastating final blow together. The entire dynamic of our situation had completely shifted in a matter of moments. She was actively reclaiming her powerful position as the absolute head of our family. Our united front was entirely impenetrable. They would soon face her unwavering wrath. We would show no mercy whatsoever during the proceedings. Our ultimate victory was completely absolute today. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung open to reveal a massive room completely packed to absolute capacity. The high-profile nature of the financial scandal and the subsequent attempted murder charges had drawn an enormous crowd of local journalists, former business associates, and curious spectators. The oppressive silence inside the grand architectural space carried a distinct heavy weight of impending absolute justice. The harsh morning sunlight streamed through the tall stained glass windows, illuminating the polished wooden benches and the rigid postures of the attendees. I sat completely still in the front row, wearing my pristine, formal dark suit, waiting with absolute composure for the proceedings to officially commence. A side door near the judge's bench clicked loudly. 2 armed federal marshals escorted Cameron and Megan directly into the center of the judicial chamber. They were completely stripped of their expensive designer clothing and their arrogant manufactured prestige. They wore standard-issue vibrant orange prison jumpsuits, their wrists firmly bound by heavy steel handcuffs chained securely to their waists. Megan's posture was entirely broken. Her shoulders slumped forward and her face appeared gaunt, entirely drained of the vicious, calculating energy she had wielded so proudly during her luxurious restaurant celebration just months prior. Cameron shuffled closely beside her, keeping his swollen, bruised face angled downward toward the scuffed linoleum floor. He refused to make eye contact with the gallery, thoroughly crushed by the sheer humiliation of his highly publicized downfall. They stood silently behind the defense table, flanking their visibly stressed legal counsel. The stern federal judge entered the grand courtroom, taking his elevated seat with a resounding strike of his wooden gavel. He immediately called the formal session to order, commanding the absolute attention of every single person present in the room today. Before the prosecuting attorney could deliver his opening statement, I stood up from the front gallery and walked directly to the rear staging area. I firmly gripped the handles of a specialized transport wheelchair and slowly pushed my wife directly down the center aisle of the packed courtroom. Valerie sat perfectly upright, dressed in an elegant navy blazer projecting an unbreakable, formidable aura. A loud collective gasp rippled through the gathered spectators. Megan snapped her head up at the sudden sound. The exact second her eyes registered Valerie's physical presence, every single ounce of blood completely drained from her pale face. Her knees buckled slightly, forcing her defense attorney to physically support her weight. She had genuinely convinced herself that the severe chemical damage she inflicted would leave my wife a permanently silenced vegetable. Seeing Valerie looking so incredibly strong and entirely lucid utterly destroyed her remaining psychological defenses. The judge granted Valerie immediate permission to deliver her victim impact statement directly to the official court record. I parked her wheelchair securely beside the witness stand. Valerie did not shed a single tear or raise her voice. She stared directly into Megan's terrified eyes and delivered a highly precise, completely emotionless testimony. She explicitly detailed the terrifying, isolated moments inside the intensive care unit. She clearly described the harsh metallic taste of the unregulated synthetic narcotics Megan had violently forced down her throat. She flawlessly recounted her strategic survival mechanism, explaining how she deliberately feigned compliance before aggressively spitting the lethal toxins into her pillowcase the instant the heavy wooden door locked. Her incredibly sharp, factual recollection left absolutely zero room for legal interpretation or defensive manipulation. The chilling accuracy of her undeniable survival narrative completely silenced the massive room. Megan's high-priced defense attorney slowly closed his heavy legal binder and sat down heavily in his leather chair. He completely abandoned all his prepared arguments, recognizing that contesting such profound, irrefutable testimony would only further antagonize the honorable court. The federal judge adjusted his glasses, his stern expression hardening into absolute disgust as he surveyed the two shattered criminals standing before his elevated bench. He did not offer them any leniency or prolonged lectures. He addressed Megan directly, explicitly condemning her sociopathic greed and her terrifyingly calculated assassination attempt against an entirely innocent, loving woman. He officially sentenced her to exactly 25 years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, strictly removing any future possibility of early parole. He then turned his unyielding focus entirely onto Cameron. He thoroughly lambasted my son for his profound cowardice, his massive financial fraud against the Pierce Industrial Trust, and his highly disgusting, unforgivable elder abuse. He swiftly delivered a consecutive 15-year prison sentence, permanently ensuring his total isolation from society. The swift, heavy hammer of absolute justice had decisively fallen, completely eradicating their malicious existence from our lives forever, and finally securing our ultimate peace. The sharp, distinct sound of heavy steel chains rattling against the wooden defense table signaled the absolute conclusion of the legal proceedings. The stern federal judge forcefully struck his wooden gavel one final time, officially dismissing the court and ordering the immediate physical transfer of the convicted prisoners. 4 heavily armed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, firmly grasping the bright orange fabric of Cameron and Megan's prison uniforms. They forcefully directed the shattered couple toward the secured holding area located at the far side of the massive judicial chamber. As the bailiffs forcefully guided them down the central walkway, Cameron suddenly stopped moving. He planted his worn canvas shoes firmly against the polished linoleum floor, desperately resisting the immense physical pull of his armed captors. He turned his bruised, tear-stained face toward the gallery and locked his desperate, frantic eyes directly onto mine. The oppressive silence of the departing courtroom amplified his incredibly fragile, broken voice. He openly wept, uttering a pathetic, completely useless apology for his monstrous greed and his unforgivable betrayal. He frantically begged for a singular ounce of fatherly forgiveness before facing his bleak, terrifying decade inside the brutal federal penitentiary system. I remained perfectly still beside my wife's wheelchair. I did not display a single trace of residual anger, nor did I project any semblance of underlying parental pity. I simply stared directly into his utterly defeated eyes and offered a single highly deliberate nod. That incredibly subtle, completely silent gesture formally acknowledged the absolute permanent end of his toxic influence over my life forever. The bailiffs violently yanked his heavy steel chains, roughly dragging his sobbing broken body through the heavy security doors and entirely out of our existence. I smoothly gripped the handles of Valerie's wheelchair, effortlessly rotating the mechanical device around to face the main exit. We calmly navigated through the parting crowd of stunned journalists and silent spectators, stepping gracefully through the massive mahogany doors and out into the crisp, refreshing air. The bright, warming morning sun was rapidly rising over the sprawling city skyline, casting a beautiful, radiant glow across the grand concrete steps of the federal courthouse. The immediate suffocating threat against my beloved family was officially and permanently neutralized today. Our incredibly long, intensely grueling nightmare was finally concluded. We quietly descended the wide stone staircase together, completely ready to peacefully reclaim our beautiful, undisturbed twilight years. The immediate aftermath of the federal sentencing brought a profound cleansing silence to our lives. Valerie and I returned to our expansive suburban estate with a singular, unwavering mission to completely purge our home of their lingering toxic presence. We refused to spend our newly reclaimed twilight years surrounded by the physical remnants of their sociopathic greed. I immediately hired an elite, highly discreet professional removal crew to systematically strip the property of any items remotely connected to my treacherous son and his criminal wife. The heavy industrial trucks arrived before sunrise, parking neatly along the circular driveway. The uniformed workers moved with absolute mechanical efficiency through the wide corridors of our home. They decisively boxed up every single photograph, every holiday ornament, and every lingering personal effect Cameron had ever left behind during his manipulative, self-serving visits. Valerie sat comfortably in her sunroom, drinking her morning tea and directing the systematic erasure of the people who had actively attempted to murder her. She pointed a steady finger toward the expensive guest room furniture Megan had presumptuously purchased with our stolen funds, ordering the crew to dismantle the heavy mahogany bed frame and remove the imported silk curtains. I watched the workers carry the heavy boxes directly out the front door, physically dismantling the false legacy Cameron had so desperately tried to weaponize against us. The house felt instantly lighter, practically breathing again, as the oppressive weight of their deceit was carried away. We were not merely cleaning a physical space. We were actively executing a profound psychological exorcism. Every empty wall and every cleared shelf represented our ultimate, undeniable survival. We were finally and permanently reclaiming our beloved sanctuary, deliberately preparing the immaculate foundation for a peaceful, entirely secure future, completely devoid of their vicious, calculating venom forever and always. The subsequent phase of our comprehensive cleansing required absolute financial obliteration. Because Cameron had foolishly pledged a fraudulent property deed to secure his illicit capital from the Pierce Industrial Trust, my legal team possessed the total, unmitigated authority to aggressively seize every single asset he and Megan owned. I directly instructed Attorney Bradley to officially execute the immediate, merciless liquidation of their entire lavish estate without delay. The federal courts swiftly granted our corporate subsidiary the absolute right to confiscate their luxury vehicles, draining their accounts to cover the massive, fraudulent debt they had accrued. Bradley dispatched specialized repossession agents to their upscale downtown condominium. The recovery teams ruthlessly impounded Cameron's expensive imported sports car and Megan's high-end luxury SUV directly from their private parking garage. The agents subsequently cleared out their extensive designer wardrobes, auctioning off every piece of high-fashion clothing, diamond jewelry, and custom artwork they had accumulated through their deceitful corporate maneuvering. I watched the liquidation reports arrive daily, verifying the systematic dismantling of their shallow materialistic universe. They were completely stripped of the pretentious luxury they valued above human life. However, I absolutely refused to allow their tainted, blood-soaked money to remain within our personal banking portfolios. Valerie and I firmly decided to transform their malicious greed into profound generational healing. We took the entire massive sum generated from the total liquidation of their seized assets and officially established a permanent, fully funded medical scholarship program. We deliberately structured the financial trust to exclusively support brilliant, underprivileged African American students pursuing advanced degrees in pharmacology and internal medicine. We effectively weaponized their sociopathic theft to actively cultivate future generations of dedicated healers, ensuring that their toxic legacy would forever fund the exact scientific disciplines they had weaponized against my wife. While the legal and financial mechanisms flawlessly executed our calculated redistribution, we simultaneously fortified our physical stronghold. I personally oversaw the meticulous installation of highly advanced, specialized biometric security systems across our entire sprawling property perimeter. We changed every single physical lock on the estate, replacing the standard deadbolts with impenetrable military-grade locking mechanisms requiring encrypted digital authorization. I physically removed the heavily damaged steel safe from my private home office, the lingering visual reminder of Cameron's violent betrayal. I actively installed a vastly superior reinforced titanium vault directly into the concrete foundation of the room, implementing a dual authentication retinal scanner to ensure absolute permanent security. The physical barricades perfectly mirrored our renewed psychological boundaries. We had successfully purged the aggressive poison from our immediate environment, systematically fortifying our sanctuary against any future incursions. Our home was officially transformed into an impregnable, secure fortress of safety, completely immune to the dangerous avarice that had previously infected our lives. Our massive financial empire, our protected physical property, and our deep emotional tranquility were fundamentally secured through decisive, incredibly unyielding legal action. The rigorous purification process was nearly finished, leaving us standing strong, entirely unburdened, and wholly victorious against the terrifying darkness they had unleashed upon our family. The late afternoon sun cast long, warm shadows across the polished mahogany floor of my newly secured home office. I sat comfortably behind my expansive desk, projecting absolute authority, while Attorney Bradley meticulously arranged a thick stack of finalized legal documents before me. Our extensive, incredibly calculating operation was rapidly approaching its ultimate definitive conclusion. We were officially executing the final phase of our comprehensive defensive strategy to secure our remaining future. Bradley handed me a customized fountain pen, his expression radiating absolute professional respect and deep admiration. I smoothly uncapped the heavy instrument and began signing my name across the crisp official pages of the newly restructured family trust. With every single deliberate stroke of ink, I legally and permanently erased Cameron's name from our massive financial empire. He was entirely disinherited, completely stripped of any future access to the immense wealth I had tirelessly built over 4 decades of rigorous, dedicated labor. Our vast corporate holdings, massive offshore investments, and highly lucrative pharmaceutical patents were completely locked away behind an impenetrable, incredibly complex, multi-tiered legal fortress. Bradley carefully gathered the signed documents, swiftly securing them inside his locked leather briefcase with practiced efficiency. He respectfully nodded his head, verbally confirming that the complex financial transition was absolutely legally binding and entirely irreversible forever. The silent adjustment was finally completely, utterly finished. I leaned back into my comfortable leather chair, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of absolute victory settling deeply into my bones. The ruthless, highly arrogant predators who had foolishly viewed my quiet demeanor as a pathetic vulnerability were now permanently rotting inside maximum security federal prison cells, thoroughly crushed by the invisible mechanisms they had completely underestimated. They had aggressively attempted to steal a massive, thriving empire, but they had violently collided with an unyielding, incredibly prepared titan. My beautiful, fiercely resilient wife was happily resting down the hall, entirely safe from their venomous reach. I looked out the large window, watching the vibrant sunset paint the quiet suburban skyline in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. The violent storm had completely passed, leaving behind a perfectly cleansed, heavily fortified kingdom. The silent adjustment had successfully restored our ultimate peace. I am the permanent, undisputed architect of my own absolute justice. My family remains forever unbroken, thriving securely beyond the pathetic reach of superficial greed and treacherous ambition. Our tranquil, perfectly insulated paradise is ours alone to enjoy. The crisp, refreshing morning breeze swept gently across our sprawling suburban estate, carrying the vibrant scent of blooming jasmine and fresh pine. I sat comfortably in the heavy wooden rocking chair on our expansive front porch, watching the golden sunlight filter through the towering oak trees. The deep, absolute silence of the property felt entirely different today. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of anticipating an inevitable attack. It was the pure, unadulterated tranquility of a heavily fortified sanctuary. The heavy oak front door clicked softly behind me. I turned my head, fully expecting to see my hired private security detail executing their standard morning perimeter sweep. Instead, my breath caught firmly in my throat. Valerie stepped gracefully onto the polished wooden floorboards entirely under her own incredible physical power. She moved without her specialized transport wheelchair, without a heavy medical cane, and without a single trace of hesitation in her remarkably steady stride. She wore a simple, elegant white linen dress that perfectly complemented her newly returning vibrant complexion. Her hands were fully occupied, expertly balancing 2 steaming ceramic mugs of our favorite dark roast coffee. The sheer, undeniable strength radiating from her completely dismantled any lingering shadows of her terrifying intensive care unit ordeal. I instantly began to stand up from my rocking chair, my protective instincts immediately urging me to assist her across the wide porch. Valerie quickly locked her sharp, determined brown eyes directly onto mine and offered a small, fiercely independent shake of her head. She did not require any physical assistance. She intended to conquer this simple morning ritual entirely independently. I slowly lowered myself back into the wooden seat, watching my beautiful, profoundly resilient wife conquer the physical space. She successfully navigated the porch and carefully handed me the warm mug. We sat together in a profoundly comfortable silence, silently sipping the rich, bitter liquid, while observing the peaceful suburban street stretching out beyond our pristine, manicured lawn. During the agonizing weeks leading up to the massive federal trial, Cameron and Megan had aggressively waged a highly calculated, incredibly vicious social defamation campaign against us. They had actively visited several prominent neighbors, deliberately spreading horrible, fabricated rumors regarding our supposed mental instability and brutal financial cruelty. Their toxic objective was to systematically isolate us, ensuring no one would question their sudden hostile takeover of our expansive estate. I vividly remembered the cold, suspicious glares we had previously endured from the local community. However, the highly publicized federal sentencing had completely shattered their deceptive narrative. The undeniable judicial outcome definitively exposed their sociopathic greed to the entire world, completely exonerating our actions. As we sat on the porch, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, our longtime neighbors from directly across the street, slowly walked past our heavy iron gates during their routine morning stroll. A few short weeks ago, they would have nervously averted their eyes and quickly accelerated their pace to aggressively avoid any social interaction. Today, they abruptly stopped their walk. Mr. Henderson looked directly at me, his posture radiating a deep, undeniable respect. He offered a firm, highly deliberate wave while his wife smiled warmly toward Valerie, projecting genuine relief and profound admiration for her miraculous recovery. I politely returned their friendly gesture, acknowledging their silent, deeply validating apology. They smoothly continued down the sunny sidewalk, leaving me to profoundly reflect on the incredibly complex nature of human relationships. My own biological son had ruthlessly attempted to eradicate our existence, merely to aggressively accelerate his unearned financial inheritance. He had weaponized our shared genetics, arrogantly believing his fundamental status as my child permanently guaranteed him absolute immunity from my wrath. He was catastrophically incorrect. I now recognized with absolute crystal clarity that bloodlines are entirely meaningless without the incredibly vital foundation of unwavering mutual loyalty. True family is never defined by a simple genetic lottery or an inherited surname. Real family is explicitly forged through honorable actions, consistent respect, and an unyielding commitment to actively protect one another during moments of severe vulnerability. Cameron had voluntarily chosen to transform himself into a vicious, highly toxic parasite. I had decisively chosen to protect my incredibly strong, loving wife and actively preserve my own hard-earned dignity by completely excising his poisonous presence from my entire life. I refused to allow my fundamental fatherly instincts to be aggressively exploited by a treacherous criminal. Eradicating his malicious influence was not an act of cruelty. It was a mandatory, highly calculated act of profound self-preservation. I looked down at the dark coffee resting inside my ceramic mug, feeling an overwhelming, highly powerful sense of absolute justification. Removing the severe infection had successfully saved the host. Our guarded property now reflected the pristine internal peace we had rightfully achieved. Actions guaranteed our future remained untouched by greed. I slowly raised the heavy ceramic mug to my lips and took a long, deliberate sip of the dark, steaming coffee. The rich, bold flavor washed over my palate, serving as a grounding reminder of the incredibly beautiful simplicity returning to our daily existence. The chaotic, profoundly destructive storm that had aggressively ravaged our lives over the past grueling month was finally entirely gone. It had been systematically dismantled and permanently erased by a sequence of highly calculated, entirely unapologetic legal retaliations. I leaned back into the comfortable wooden rocking chair, feeling the gentle morning sunlight actively warming my face. The chirping birds overhead provided a soothing, incredibly peaceful melody that perfectly matched our serene environment. I had learned an invaluable, incredibly hard-fought lesson throughout this horrific ordeal. I profoundly realized that true, enduring peace is never achieved through passive submission or endless, unreciprocated sacrifices. Absolute tranquility is only successfully achieved by forcefully setting rigid, impenetrable boundaries and maintaining the sheer, unwavering courage to aggressively defend them against any invading threat. By completely excising the toxic parasites who had maliciously disguised themselves as loving family members, we had effectively guaranteed our own permanent survival. I slowly turned my head toward the right, looking directly at Valerie as she sat gracefully in the matching wooden rocking chair beside me. She caught my steady gaze immediately, her sharp, intelligent brown eyes crinkling at the corners as a bright, incredibly warm smile illuminated her beautiful face. The horrifying shadow of her intensive care unit nightmare had entirely vanished completely, replaced by an unbreakable, radiant aura of triumphant resilience. We did not need to speak a single word to communicate our profound mutual understanding. The disgusting, unforgivable betrayal perpetrated by our greedy son and his manipulative wife was now an officially closed chapter permanently sealed away behind locked federal prison doors and highly fortified legal trusts. They could never hurt us again. We had successfully weathered the ultimate devastating betrayal, emerging from the violent darkness significantly stronger and entirely unified. I placed my warm hand gently over hers, feeling the strong, steady pulse of her beating heart beneath my fingers. We sat together in absolute harmony, deeply appreciating every single vibrant breath we now shared without fear. The profound strength we forged will permanently protect our sacred bond. Our real, beautifully unburdened life officially begins today, perfectly insulated from their poison, finally completely free. I stepped out of the freezing concrete hallway and silently entered the adjacent observation room. A massive, large glass mirror dominated the center of the wall, providing a flawless view directly into the second interrogation chamber. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as I stood beside the lead federal investigator. Megan sat at the center of the scratched metal table, her expensive designer gown completely ruined and hanging off her shoulders in dirty, torn layers. She had spent the entire car ride from the airport frantically constructing a desperate, entirely fabricated narrative to save her own pathetic life. She violently wiped fake tears from her eyes, aggressively deploying her most practiced look of profound, victimized terror. Two seasoned detectives sat across from her, their faces entirely neutral as they recorded her frantic testimony. Megan launched into a highly theatrical, flawlessly delivered performance. She vehemently claimed that Cameron was a dangerously abusive, violently controlling husband who had ruthlessly forced her into absolute compliance. She painted herself as a terrified, helpless hostage trapped inside a toxic marriage completely stripped of her own free will. She aggressively lied to the federal agents, loudly insisting that she had absolutely zero knowledge of the illicit money laundering operations or the stolen corporate funds. She shamelessly weaponized genuine domestic abuse survival narratives to shield her own sociopathic greed. She practically hyperventilated dramatically, clutching her chest while stating that Cameron had explicitly threatened to physically destroy her if she dared to contact the authorities. She intended to completely sacrifice her beaten husband, dumping the entirety of their massive criminal enterprise squarely onto his broken shoulders. I watched her desperate manipulation unfold with absolute cold precision. She truly believed her very wealthy, sophisticated victim routine would successfully manipulate the criminal justice system and grant her absolute legal immunity. Megan leaned aggressively forward across the scratched metal table, desperately attempting to solidify her fabricated innocence. She stared directly into the lead detective's eyes, dramatically insisting that Cameron had explicitly ordered her to administer the lethal black market narcotics to his dying mother. She sobbed violently, claiming her husband had meticulously orchestrated the entire homicidal scheme to aggressively expedite his massive financial inheritance. She vehemently stated that she had simply followed his terrifying domestic commands, fearing he would physically destroy her if she ever refused his sociopathic directives. Her performance was incredibly convincing, meticulously designed to legally establish Cameron as the solitary mastermind behind the gruesome medical assassination attempt. The two federal detectives continued writing their detailed notes, allowing her desperate perjury to completely fill the silent interrogation chamber. Before Megan could successfully finalize her treacherous legal maneuver, the heavy steel door suddenly swung wide open. Attorney Bradley strode confidently into the sterile concrete room, wearing his impeccably tailored charcoal suit and projecting absolute, unwavering legal authority. He completely ignored Megan's tearful, bewildered expression. He walked directly toward the center of the interrogation table and firmly placed a sleek digital tablet onto the cold steel surface. He tapped the glowing glass screen once, instantly initiating the encrypted audio playback sequence I had successfully captured via my hidden living room surveillance network. The pristine high-definition audio recording immediately blasted through the tablet's powerful internal speakers, filling the tiny room with indisputable criminal evidence. Megan's own arrogant, highly recognizable voice echoed loudly against the concrete walls. The crystal-clear audio vividly captured her gleefully bragging to Cameron about successfully purchasing the untraceable, heart-stopping synthetic drugs directly from a notorious dark web pharmaceutical vendor. The recording explicitly detailed her own meticulous, cold-blooded plan to personally bypass the hospital security protocols and forcefully poison Valerie without triggering any standard toxicological alarms. The federal agents listened intently as the recorded Megan proudly described her brilliant murderous strategy, viciously laughing about securing my wife's vast fortune. The overwhelming audio completely obliterated her fragile, victimized facade. Megan instantly stopped crying. Her mouth hung open in absolute paralyzed horror as she listened to her own undeniable voice, enthusiastically confessing to the entire violent conspiracy. The digital recording definitively proved she was not a helpless, abused hostage following terrifying domestic orders. She was the primary, ruthless architect of the entire assassination plot. Bradley stopped the audio playback, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence to crush her remaining spirit. The lead homicide detective slowly closed his heavy notepad, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated disgust. He stood up from his rigid plastic chair, towering over the terrified woman. He formally announced that her previous criminal statements were officially classified as aggressive perjury. He explicitly informed Megan that based entirely on this newly provided, highly conclusive audio evidence, her preliminary charges were immediately being upgraded. She was no longer facing mere money laundering indictments. She was officially charged with premeditated, extremely violent attempted first-degree murder without available bail. Megan continued staring blankly at the sleek digital screen, her entire arrogant universe violently collapsing into absolute, irrevocable ruin. The sheer magnitude of her profound failure finally crushed her fragile psychological defenses completely. She slowly lowered her head onto the cold metal table, weeping silently as she comprehensively realized her luxurious life was entirely over. She would spend the remainder of her miserable existence locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of her stolen wealth, her fabricated social prestige, and her deceitful freedom. The federal agents physically hoisted her from the plastic chair, escorting her directly toward the processing center to systematically execute her formal booking procedures. The detective secured the official transcripts referenced specifically as Kich Ban Ong Daden 2_25.docx and Kich Ban Ong Daden Mao 1_25.docx inside their sealed evidentiary folders. Down the sterile hallway, Cameron endured the exact same humiliating fate, officially processed into the massive, unforgiving criminal justice system. They were finally locked away, permanently isolated from the innocent people they had so viciously targeted. I turned away from the heavy observation window, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute closure settling deep within my chest. I smoothly navigated the busy, echoing corridors of the municipal police precinct, walking with the quiet, undeniable confidence of a man who had successfully conquered an incredible darkness. I pushed open the heavy glass entrance doors and stepped outside into the crisp, refreshing morning air. The bright golden sun was steadily rising over the towering city skyline, casting a warm, brilliant light across the waking metropolis. The immediate lethal threat against my beloved family was permanently neutralized, entirely dismantled by my own unwavering strategic retaliation. Valerie was safely resting inside her heavily guarded hospital room, surrounded by dedicated medical professionals and entirely free from their toxic influence. My son and his wife were decisively incarcerated, facing decades of severe punishment for their sociopathic greed. I took a deep, steadying breath, allowing the gentle morning breeze to wash over my faded engineering suit. My flawless trap had functioned with absolute perfection, legally neutralizing the vicious predators who had arrogantly attempted to destroy my home. I calmly walked down the concrete steps, completely ready to finally return to my fiercely healing wife and rebuild our beautiful, peaceful life together without ever looking back. My calculated retaliation was officially completely finished, ending their toxic control over us absolutely forever. This grueling experience fundamentally illuminates the profound difference between biological connection and genuine familial loyalty. True family is never guaranteed by a shared bloodline or inherited name. Authentic bonds are meticulously forged through consistent respect, unwavering protection, and absolute mutual trust during moments of severe vulnerability. When toxic relatives aggressively weaponize your compassion to systematically extract your personal resources, establishing impenetrable boundaries becomes a mandatory act of ultimate preservation. Surviving vicious betrayal requires the profound courage to completely excise the poisonous elements directly from your environment. True peace is exclusively achieved by aggressively defending your dignity without any hesitation whatsoever. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.